Some mysteries survive because no one was there to record the truth. Others survive because every trace of the truth has disappeared. What remains are fragments, stories that end without explanation. Between those fragments is a silence that history has never been able to fill. They keep digging. Every season uncovers another wall, another inscription, another forgotten burial. The evidence keeps growing. So does the mystery. After generations of searching, the answers remain buried somewhere no one has thought to look, or somewhere that no longer exists. Let's begin. The sun does not so much rise over the plains of northern Babylonia as arrive. Flat, white, indifferent, laying itself across a landscape of low mounds and dry riverbeds where, somewhere beneath the silt of 5,000 years, a city once stood at the center of the known world. Its name was Akkad, or Agade, as it was sometimes written. For nearly 2 centuries, it was the seat of the first empire in recorded history, the capital from which Sargon the Great ruled a territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. And yet, today, no archaeologist can point to a single stone and say, "Here it stood." This is not the case with most ancient capitals. We know where Ur lies. We know where Babylon lies, where Nineveh lies, where Uruk lies, their ruins excavated, mapped, photographed, picked over by generations of scholars. But Akkad, the city that gave its name to an entire empire, an entire language, an entire era of Mesopotamian civilization, has simply vanished. Not metaphorically, literally. Its precise location remains, to this day, unknown. The clues we do have come almost entirely from texts, inscriptions, king lists, hymns, omens copied and recopied by scribes centuries after the city's fall. These sources describe Akkad as a place of extraordinary wealth, a city where, according to one Sumerian lament, the birds of the sky and the fish of the deep came to trade, where foreign merchants filled its markets and its temples glittered with the tribute of conquered lands. Sargon himself, in the fragments attributed to him, boasted that ships from Meluha, Magan, and Dilmun, lands as far away as the Indus Valley, docked at its quays. This was not a provincial outpost. This was, by the standards of its age, a metropolis. So, how does a city like that simply disappear? Scholars have proposed a range of explanations, most of them grounded in the shifting geography of the Tigris and Euphrates. Rivers in this region are not fixed features. Over centuries, they migrate, split, silt up, and abandon their old channels entirely. It is entirely possible that Akkad sits buried not under sand, but under meters of alluvial deposit, its ruins entombed by the very river that once made it prosperous. Others have pointed to the Akkadian Empire's dramatic collapse around 2154 BC, a collapse some researchers have linked to a period of severe, abrupt drought recorded in soil cores from northern Syria. Did the city that once fed an empire simply run out of water? Did its own foundation, built on irrigation and river trade, become the mechanism of its erasure? These are the sober theories, the ones argued in academic journals. But the silence around Akkad has also drawn more speculative voices, those who point to the near-mythic language later Mesopotamians used to describe the city's fall, language that some have read as evidence of a catastrophe more sudden and total than mere climate decline. A curse, the ancient texts claim, was laid upon Akkad by the god Enlil after King Naram-Sin's temple sacrilege. The city's fields turned to dust, its granaries to ash, in a single divine stroke. No serious historian treats this as literal event. And yet, the completeness of the city's disappearance, the total absence of a mound anyone can confidently label Akkad, has left room for the ancient story to linger at the edges of the modern search. Perhaps the truth is simpler than any of this. An accident of geography, a river that moved, a tell indistinguishable from 1,000 others dotting the Iraqi plain, waiting under a farmer's field for a shovel that has not yet come. Or perhaps something else entirely happened here, something the fragments of clay have not yet told us. Either way, the world's first empire had a heart. We have simply never found where it stopped beating. Every empire needs a founder, and every founder eventually becomes a story. Long before archaeologists began searching the silted plains of Iraq for the vanished city of Akkad, the people who once lived there were already telling tales about the man who built it. His name, in its Akkadian form, was Shar-kali, the true king, or perhaps, more tellingly, the legitimate king. A title that, on its face, sounds less like a birthright than a claim. And claims, as any historian will tell you, are usually made loudest by those who need them most. We know Sargon ruled, that much is beyond dispute. Cuneiform tablets, king lists, year names, and inscriptions commissioned during his reign, and copied for 1,000 years afterward, all agree that a man by this name founded the city of Akkad sometime around 2334 BC, and from it, built the first true empire in human history, uniting the Sumerian city-states of the south with the Semitic-speaking populations of the north under a single crown. His campaigns reached, by his own scribe's account, as far as the Mediterranean coast and the Silver Mountains of Anatolia. For nearly 2 centuries, his dynasty shaped the political grammar of Mesopotamia. This is not myth, this is history, corroborated across multiple independent sources. But ask where Sargon came from, who his parents were, how a man with no evident royal blood came to seize the throne of Kish and then remake the map of the ancient Near East, and the sources begin to thin, then contradict, then dissolve into something closer to legend. The most famous account comes from what scholars now call the Sargon birth legend, a text that survives only in copies made over 1,000 years after Sargon's death, during the reign of the Neo-Assyrian kings. In it, Sargon speaks in the first person, and what he says is extraordinary. He claims his mother was a high priestess, a woman whose position, by the sacred law of the time, would have forbidden her from bearing a child. He claims he never knew his father. He claims his mother placed him in a basket of rushes, sealed the lid with pitch, and set him adrift on the Euphrates, where the current carried him downstream until a gardener named Akkad drew him from the water and raised him as his own son. It was from this obscure and irregular beginning, the text tells us, that the goddess Ishtar took notice of the boy and granted him her favor, and eventually a throne. If this story sounds familiar, it should. The abandoned infant, the river, the basket sealed with tar, the humble man who discovers the future king and raises him unknowing of his destiny. This narrative pattern appears again, almost exactly, in the biblical account of Moses, composed many centuries later. It appears, too, in stories told about Cyrus the Great of Persia, about Romulus and Remus, about a dozen other founder figures across the ancient world. Scholars call this a hero pattern, and the folklorist Otto Rank cataloged its recurrence across cultures nearly a century ago. Does this mean the Sargon legend is pure invention, a template applied retroactively to a man whose real origins were unremarkable? Quite possibly. Later kings and the scribes who served them had every incentive to dress an upstart ruler in the borrowed robes of divine destiny. A gardener's adopted son who becomes an emperor is a far more compelling story than a minor palace official who executes a successful coup. And yet, there is something else worth sitting with here. The story was not written down, so far as we know, until throughout the Neo-Assyrian period, thledanced by a version quoted by King Ashurbanipal, suggesting the tale endured in oral tradition for well over 1,000 years before it was fixed onto clay. Why did it endure? What kernel, if any, does it preserve? Some historians have pointed out that Sargon's own inscriptions never mention royal ancestry at all. A curious omission. In a region where kings routinely trace their bloodlines to gods and legendary rulers to legitimize their power. Was this silence deliberate? Was Sargon, in fact, a man of genuinely low birth, a cupbearer to the king of Kish, as one tradition holds, who rose through sheer capability and ambition rather than pedigree, and did later generations construct the river basket legend precisely because there was no noble lineage to fall back on? If so, the legend would not be a fabrication layered over a mundane truth. It would be something closer to a euphemism, a culturally acceptable way of saying what could not otherwise be said, that the greatest king Mesopotamia had yet produced came from nothing at all. There is a further wrinkle. Some scholars have noted that the name of Sargon's mother, when it appears in later variants of the story, is never consistent, and in several versions she remains entirely unnamed, an absence that stands out sharply against the meticulous genealogies Mesopotamian scribes usually kept for their rulers. Was this an accident of textual transmission, names simply lost across centuries of copying? Or does it suggest that no name was ever known to begin with, that Sargon's origins were, from the very beginning, a blank the culture filled in with poetry rather than fact? We are left, then, with a man whose empire we can trace with precision. Its borders, its administration, its eventual unraveling, standing atop a foundation of pure uncertainty. A ruler who reshaped the ancient world, and who may have entered it as anonymously as any child ever has, nameless, fatherless, and set adrift on a river that, like the city he would one day build, kept its secrets long after the water had gone still. What, exactly, are we meant to believe happened on the banks of the Euphrates over 4,000 years ago? And what does it mean that the empire's founder is, in some sense, exactly as untraceable as the capital he left behind? Water, moving slow and brown under a flat sky, carrying whatever the current will take. Reeds bending along a muddy bank. Somewhere upstream, a woman's hands pressing pitch into the seams of a woven basket, sealing it against the river that is about to become the most consequential body of water in the story of human civilization. This is not a scene from Exodus. It is older, centuries older, and it belongs to the man who built the empire whose lost capital we have just gone searching for. His name, in Akkadian, was Shar-kali, the true king, or, perhaps more precisely, the legitimate king. A title that sounds less like an inheritance than an argument. And arguments, historians will tell you, tend to be made loudest by those with the most to prove. That Sargon ruled is not in question. Cuneiform king lists year names and inscriptions commissioned during his reign, and copied faithfully for 1,000 years after his death, all agree that a man by this name founded the city of Akkad around 2334 BC, and from it forged the first true empire in recorded history, uniting the Sumerian city-states of the south with the Semitic-speaking peoples of the north under a single crown. By his own scribe's account, his campaigns reached the Mediterranean coast in one direction and the silver-rich mountains of Anatolia in the other. For nearly 2 centuries, his dynasty defined the political order of Mesopotamia. This much is history, corroborated across independent sources separated by centuries, and in some cases by entire civilizations. But ask where Sargon came from, who his parents were, how a man with no evident royal blood came to seize the throne of Kish, and then redraw the map of the ancient Near East, and the historical record thins almost to nothing, then gives way to something closer to legend. The most complete account is a text scholars now call the Sargon birth legend, known to us only through copies made more than 1,000 years after Sargon's death, during the reign of the Neo-Assyrian kings. In it, Sargon speaks in the first person, and what he says is extraordinary. His mother, he claims, was a high priestess, a woman whose sacred office would have forbidden her from bearing a child. His father, he says, he never knew. His mother placed him in a basket of rushes, sealed the lid with pitch, and set him adrift on the Euphrates, where the current carried him downstream until a gardener named Akkad drew him from the water and raised him as his own. It was from this obscure, irregular beginning, the text tells us, that the goddess Ishtar took notice of the boy and granted him her favor, and, in time, a throne. If the shape of this story feels familiar, it should. The abandoned infant, the river, the basket sealed with tar, the humble man who unknowingly raises a future king. This same narrative architecture reappears, almost point for point, in the biblical account of Moses, composed many centuries later. It surfaces again in stories told about Cyrus the Great of Persia, about Romulus and Remus, about a long list of founder figures scattered across the ancient world. The folklorist Otto Rank catalogued the recurrence of this pattern nearly a century ago and gave it a name: the hero's birth myth. Does this mean the Sargon legend is invention? A template stitched onto a man whose actual origins were unremarkable? It's entirely possible. Later, kings and the scribes who served them had every reason to dress an upstart ruler in the borrowed robes of divine destiny. A gardener's adopted son who becomes an emperor makes a far better story than a minor palace official who simply executes a successful coup. And yet, something about the silence surrounding this story is worth sitting with. The legend, so far as we can tell, was not committed to clay until the Neo-Assyrian period, a version of it quoted directly by King Ashurbanipal, which means it may have circulated in oral form for well over 1,000 years before it was finally written down. Why did it endure that long? What, if anything, does it preserve? Some historians have pointed to a curious detail. Sargon's own inscriptions, composed during his lifetime, never once claim royal ancestry, a striking omission in a region where kings routinely traced their bloodlines back to gods and legendary rulers to shore up their legitimacy. Was that silence deliberate? Was Sargon, as one tradition holds, genuinely lowborn, a cupbearer to the king of Kish who rose through capability and ambition rather than pedigree? And did later generations construct the river basket story precisely because there was no noble lineage available to invoke? If that is the case, the legend would not be a fabrication laid over a mundane truth. It would be something closer to a euphemism, a culturally acceptable way of saying what perhaps could not otherwise be said aloud, that the greatest king Mesopotamia had yet produced came from nothing at all. There is one more detail worth noting. In the surviving versions of the story, Sargon's mother is never given a name. This is unusual. Mesopotamian scribes kept meticulous genealogies for their rulers, tracing lineages back generations with evident care. Is her namelessness simply an accident of transmission, a detail lost somewhere across 1,000 years of copying? Or does it suggest that no name was ever known to begin with? That Sargon's origins were, from the very start, a blank space the culture chose to fill with poetry rather than fact? What, then, are we meant to make of a man whose empire we can trace with remarkable precision? Its borders, its administration, its eventual collapse, resting atop a foundation of such total uncertainty? And what does it mean exactly that the founder of the world's first empire may be just as untraceable as the capital he built and then somehow left for the desert to swallow whole? A century would pass. The nameless boy in the basket, if he ever existed at all, would grow old and die. His sons would inherit an empire built on conquest and hold it, more or less, for 2 more generations. And then, sometime around 2154 BC, the written record of Mesopotamia begins to describe something that reads less like a political transition and more like the end of the world. Picture a stone monument, weathered and fragmentary, unearthed at Susa in what is now western Iran and now housed in the Louvre. It shows a king in profile, bow in hand, ascending a mountain slope beneath a sky crowded with stars. This is the victory stele of Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon, and at the time of its carving, it commemorated a triumph, a campaign against a mountain people called the Lulubai. But look at the stele long enough, and a strange feeling sets in, because within a generation of this monument's completion, the empire it celebrates would collapse, and Mesopotamian scribes for centuries afterward would blame that collapse on a people almost as obscure as the mountain tribe Naram-Sin is shown defeating, a group the texts call the Gutians. Who were the Gutians? This is where the certainty of the historical record, so solid when describing Sargon's administrative reforms or his empire's road networks, begins to dissolve into fog. What we know for certain is this. Sometime in the final years of the Akkadian Empire, Mesopotamian textual sources begin describing incursions by a people from the Zagros Mountains, the rugged highlands stretching along the eastern edge of the Mesopotamian plain. The Sumerian king list, composed later and prone to hyperbole, describes their rule in apocalyptic terms, claiming the Gutian dynasty consisted of 21 kings who reigned for a combined 91 years, though it also famously suggests some of these kings ruled mere months, even days, an instability that itself hints at chaos rather than conquest. A poem known as The Curse of Akkad, composed generations after the fact, goes further still, describing the Gutians as beings who possessed human intelligence but the instincts of dogs, with the features of monkeys. Language so vivid, so dehumanizing, that modern historians read it not as ethnography but as trauma, processed through poetry, by a civilization trying to explain how the mightiest empire it had ever known simply came apart. And this is the first problem. Nearly everything we know about the Gutians comes from the people who despised them, the Sumerians and Akkadians who survived their incursion and, once the crisis passed, wrote the history. No Gutian inscriptions have been found. No Gutian city has been excavated. No administrative archive, no king's palace, no burial site can be confidently attributed to them. We do not know what language they spoke, though the handful of Gutian royal names preserved in Mesopotamian king lists appear linguistically unrelated to Akkadian, Sumerian, or any other known tongue of the region, a genuine anomaly, one that has led some linguists to suggest the Gutians may represent a lost language family entirely, spoken and then extinguished without leaving a single independent trace behind. Is this evidence of a truly foreign, unassimilated people exactly as hostile chroniclers described? Or is it simply what happens when history is written exclusively by the losers of an encounter, resentful and unreliable narrators of their own defeat? The mainstream explanation, favored by most archaeologists today, is comparatively sober. The Akkadian Empire did not fall because of the Gutians so much as it fell, and the Gutians filled the vacuum. Soil core samples taken from ancient lake beds in northern Syria, published in studies beginning in the early 1990s, show a sharp increase in wind-blown dust and a corresponding drop in settlement activity dated to almost precisely this period. Physical evidence of an abrupt, severe drought that may have crippled the agricultural base the Akkadian state depended on. Under this reading, the Gutians were less an invading horde than opportunistic highlanders, moving into a plain already emptied by famine and administrative collapse, blamed after the fact for a catastrophe that climate, not conquest, had already set in motion. But this explanation, however well supported by sediment and pollen data, does not fully satisfy every question the sources raise. Why does the Curse of Akkad describe the invaders in language so specifically dehumanizing? So, unlike the way Mesopotamian texts typically describe rival Semitic or Elamite peoples, whom they generally depicted as recognizably human, if uncivilized. Why does the archaeological record show such a near-total absence of Gutian material culture, when even nomadic and semi-nomadic groups elsewhere in the ancient Near East typically leave some trace? Pottery styles, grave goods, distinctive tools. Some scholars have gone so far as to question whether Gutian functioned less as an ethnic label and more as a catch-all term, a name Mesopotamian scribes applied to almost any unfamiliar highland group blamed for the era's disorder, in the same way later chroniclers might use barbarian to describe an enemy whose actual identity had become irrelevant next to the fact of the damage they caused. If that's true, then the Gutians as a distinct people, cohesive, organized, ruled by the 21 kings the king list so precisely enumerates, may never have existed in the form the texts describe at all. The empire may have simply broken beneath its own weight and the region's shifting climate, and the survivors, needing someone to blame for a century of chaos, reached for a name from the mountains and made it carry the weight of an apocalypse it may never have caused, which leaves us with a stele in a French museum, a king mid-triumph on a mountainside, and a question that 4,000 years of scholarship still has not resolved. When an empire vanishes, how much of what destroyed it was ever real? And how much was simply the shape its survivors needed the catastrophe to take? A poem survives, not carved in stone like Naram-Sin's stele, but pressed instead into clay, dozens of fragmentary tablets, copied and recopied by scribes in the centuries after the events they describe, until enough overlapping pieces were recovered by modern archaeologists to reconstruct something close to a complete text. We have already heard fragments of it, its description of the invaders who supposedly ended an empire. But the poem's true subject is not the Gutians at all. It is a curse, and the question of who cast it, and why, and whether an entire civilization once genuinely believed its own capital had been condemned by a god, deserves its own careful look. Modern scholars call this text the Curse of Akkad, or sometimes the Curse of Agade. It was composed, most likely within a few generations of the Akkadian Empire's collapse, close enough to the events for real memory to survive in it, distant enough for that memory to have already hardened into myth. And its narrative is, on its face, extraordinary. The poem tells us that the god Enlil, chief deity of the Sumerian pantheon and patron of the sacred city of Nippur, turned against Akkad because of the actions of Naram-Sin, the same king shown triumphant on the mountain in his victory stele. According to the poem, Naram-Sin, enraged by an inauspicious omen, defied the will of the gods and attacked Enlil's own temple, the Eker, tearing it down stone by stone. In response, the poem tells us, Enlil summoned the Gutians down from the mountains as an instrument of divine punishment, and further cursed the city itself. Its fields would no longer yield grain, its canals would silt with dust, its granaries would fill not with barley but with weeds, and the city that had stood at the center of the known world would be left so that where a foundation of a house had been laid, a stranger would not remove it. Here is where the historian's task becomes genuinely difficult, because the poem is, transparently, propaganda, composed, most scholars agree, under the patronage of a later dynasty based in the city of Ur, a dynasty with every political incentive to portray Akkad's fall as divine punishment for royal arrogance, and by extension to portray their own rule as pious and therefore secure. Ancient texts across the Near East follow this pattern constantly. Kings fall because kings sin, and the gods who unmake them can, by the same logic, be trusted to protect whoever writes the next chapter. Reading the Curse of Akkad purely as literal history would be, by any reasonable historical standard, a mistake. And yet the poem will not quite let itself be dismissed as simple political theater either, because embedded within its mythic framework are details that align, with unsettling precision, with what the physical record now independently confirms. The poem describes the abandonment of agriculture, the failure of grain, the silting of canals, the collapse of long-distance trade, and this is almost exactly the picture that soil core data from Tel Leilan and other sites across northern Syria has revealed. A sudden, severe aridification event beginning around 2200 BC, a drought so significant that the settlement was abandoned for centuries afterward. Did the poem's authors, composing generations after the fact, somehow preserve an authentic folk memory of an actual climatic catastrophe, one they had no scientific framework to explain, and so rendered instead as divine wrath? Or is the resemblance coincidental? Two societies independently describing agricultural failure, a common enough disaster in Mesopotamian history, in terms that only appear to converge. There is a further layer worth sitting with. The poem insists with striking specificity that Akkad's ruin would be total and permanent, that the city would never be resettled, that its very location would be forgotten, cursed so thoroughly that even scavengers would not pick through its ruins. And this is, as far as the archaeological record can tell us, precisely what happened. Every other major Mesopotamian capital, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Babylon, was resettled, rebuilt, occupied again and again across the centuries, leaving the layered mounds modern archaeologists still excavate today. Akkad alone has never been found. Not one mound, not one inscribed brick found in situ, not one confirmed trace. Is this simply the accident of a river's shifting course, as more conventional explanations hold? Or did a curse composed as political flattery for a rival dynasty somehow describe correctly a fate that no one at the time could have actually predicted? Most historians would caution against reading too much into this. Coincidence, after all, is not causation, and a poem written to serve a king's propaganda needs no supernatural help to occasionally align with later fact. Mesopotamia's climate history was turbulent enough that any curse invoking drought and famine had reasonably good odds of appearing to come true. But it is difficult, sitting with the text today, not to notice how completely its central prophecy was fulfilled. A city cursed to vanish from memory. A city that, 4,000 years later, still has. What was it, then, that the scribes of Ur were truly describing when they wrote of Enlil's rage? A genuine folk memory of catastrophe passed down through generations, dressed in the language of gods because no other language existed to explain it. Or something closer to an accidental prophecy. Words meant only to flatter a living king that somehow reached forward and, without meaning to, described the fate of a city no one has ever found. Travel back now, away from the scribal quarters of Ur and the curse they would eventually compose, to an earlier moment, decades before that poem existed, decades before any drought had begun to dry the canals. Travel to the plain surrounding Kish, one of the oldest and most sacred cities in Sumer, sometime around 2250 BC. Somewhere on that plain, according to inscriptions Naram-Sin himself commissioned, a coalition of Mesopotamian cities rose up against him almost simultaneously, an uprising so vast, so coordinated, that the king's own scribes struggled to describe its scale. If the Curse of Akkad asks why the empire fell to outsiders, this episode asks a harder question. Why, a full generation before any Gutian ever crossed the Zagros, did the empire's own people try to tear it apart from within? The events themselves are documented with unusual detail for this period. thanks to a series of royal inscriptions Naram-Sin commissioned to commemorate his victory. According to these texts, a coalition of cities, including Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Dare, and others, rose in near-simultaneous rebellion, led by rulers the inscriptions name as Ifur Kish and Amar Girid, kings of Kish and Uruk respectively. Naram-Sin claims to have fought and won 9 battles in a single year against this coalition, a campaign so intense that later Mesopotamian tradition would remember him, alongside his grandfather Sargon, as one of the 2 great warrior kings of the Akkadian line. The rebellion, by his own account, very nearly succeeded. This was not a border skirmish or a minor provincial disturbance. This was the empire's own foundation. The Sumerian heartland Sargon had first united, the cities that had provided the administrative backbone of Akkadian rule, turning almost as one against the throne. Why? The inscriptions themselves, naturally, offer no real answer beyond the arrogance of rebellious subjects and the righteousness of their eventual defeat. This is, after all, royal propaganda, no more objective in its own way than the Curse of Akkad would later be. But historians examining the broader pattern of Akkadian rule have proposed several explanations. And here again, the record shifts from documented fact toward informed reconstruction. The most widely accepted explanation centers on the nature of Akkadian imperial administration itself. Sargon and his successors ruled a territory unlike anything that had existed before in Mesopotamia. A multi-ethnic, multi-city empire held together not by shared culture or long precedent, but by military garrisons, appointed governors, and the loyalty of Akkadian officials installed over previously independent city-states that had, for centuries, governed themselves under their own dynasties and their own patron gods. Each of these cities, Kish, Uruk, Ur, had its own proud religious and political traditions, its own claim to primacy going back, in some cases, to the legendary era before the Great Flood itself, as later king lists remembered it. Is it any wonder that these cities, garrisoned by foreign administrators and taxed to support a distant capital, might seize any opportunity to reassert their independence? Under this reading, the Great Rebellion was less a mystery than an inevitability, the natural friction of the world's first experiment in multi-city imperial rule, a structural weakness built into the Akkadian project from its very first year. But other historians have pointed to something more specific and more troubling, embedded in Naram-Sin's own inscriptions, his unprecedented claim to divinity. Where Sargon and his immediate successors had ruled as favored servants of the gods, Naram-Sin appears to be the first Mesopotamian king to have himself formally deified during his own lifetime. His name, written in official texts, preceded by the divine determinative ordinarily reserved for gods alone. Some scholars have proposed that this act, startling even by the standards of an already unprecedented empire, may have been the spark that ignited the rebellion, an overreach so severe that Sumer's traditional city-states, whose religious institutions had for centuries mediated the relationship between mortal kings and the divine, could not tolerate a ruler who claimed to have erased that distinction entirely. Was Naram-Sin's later reputation as the king whose sacrilege, according to the Curse of Akkad, brought down Enlil's wrath and doomed the empire, rooted in a real memory of this claim to godhood? Did the poem's authors, writing generations later, conflate 2 separate transgressions, the temple's destruction and the king's self-deification, into a single, simplified act of hubris? We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Naram-Sin won. The rebellion was crushed, the coalition cities were subdued, and the king who survived it went on to expand the empire to its greatest territorial extent, campaigning as far as Anatolia and the Persian Gulf. And yet, the fact that such a rebellion was possible at all That the empire's own heartland could rise so completely, so nearly successfully, against the throne that had built it, suggests a fragility beneath Akkad's golden age that its monuments and inscriptions worked very hard to conceal, which raises a final, uncomfortable question. If an empire's own cities could turn against it with such force, so many decades before any drought withered the fields, or any Gutian descended from the mountains, was the Akkadian Empire ever truly as unified as its stele and its scribes claimed it to be? Or was the Great Rebellion simply the first crack in a structure that had been straining against its own weight from the very beginning? Waiting, all along, for something to finish what Kish and Uruk had already started. The question that closed the last chapter, whether an empire's gravest threats came from without or from within, did not end with the suppression of the Great Rebellion. It followed the Akkadian throne for the rest of its history, and nowhere does it echo more strangely than in the case of the empire's third king, a ruler named Manishtushu, whose reign ended in a manner later Mesopotamian tradition remembered with unusual, pointed specificity. He was murdered, the sources tell us, by his own courtiers. Manishtushu is, by any measure, one of the more obscure figures in the Akkadian dynasty, overshadowed on one side by his father, Sargon, and on the other by his brother Rimush, who preceded him on the throne, and by his son, Naram-Sin, whose reign would eclipse them all. What we know of Manishtushu's rule comes primarily from his own inscriptions and a small number of later references, and the picture they paint is of a competent, if unspectacular, king. Military campaigns against Elam and Anshan to the east, extensive land purchases documented on a famous inscribed obelisk now held in the Louvre, temple construction at Nippur and elsewhere. Nothing in the official record suggests instability. Nothing suggests a court in crisis. And then, near the end, there is a single striking fragment, preserved in a much later Mesopotamian chronicle, the sort of text scholars call an omen compilation, in which historical events were recorded centuries after the fact because they were believed to carry portents for the future. This text states plainly and without elaboration that Manishtushu was killed by his own servants, murdered inside what should have been the safest place in the empire, his own palace, presumably in Akkad itself, the city whose location remains unknown to us even now. The brevity of this account is, in its own way, more unsettling than any elaborate narrative could be. We are given no names, no motive, no account of how the killing was carried out or what followed, whether conspirators were caught and punished, whether the palace guard was purged, whether the murder triggered any wider crisis of succession. We know only that a king who had ruled competently, expanded his territory, and left behind inscriptions boasting of legitimate land acquisitions and temple piety, met his end not on a battlefield or through the working of divine curse, but through the hands of the men whose entire function was to protect him. Why would courtiers move against a king who, as far as the official record shows, gave them no obvious cause? Here, historians are working with almost nothing, and the theories that have emerged are by necessity speculative. One line of reasoning returns to the same structural tensions that fueled the Great Rebellion a generation earlier. If the Akkadian court, like the empire's subject cities, contained factions uneasy with the increasing concentration of royal power, a concentration that would reach its extreme under Manishtushu's own son, Naram-Sin, with his claim to living godhood, then perhaps the seeds of that unease were already present in the father's reign, expressing themselves not through open rebellion, but through the quieter, more intimate violence of a palace conspiracy. A court is a small enough space that a single ambitious official, or a coalition of them, might succeed where an entire coalition of cities had only narrowly failed. Another theory looks toward the succession itself, Manishtushu was followed by Naram-Sin, and while the transition between them left no explicit trace of controversy in the surviving record, the near-simultaneous timing of a palace murder and a generational transfer of power is, at minimum, suggestive. Succession crises are common enough across Mesopotamian history, and later Akkadian and Assyrian sources alike are full of examples of princes, brothers, and court officials maneuvering, sometimes violently, to shape who would next sit the throne. Could Manishtushu's murder have been connected to exactly this kind of struggle? A moment when rival factions within the palace acted to determine which candidate or which faction's interests would prevail. The Omen text gives us no such connection explicitly, but the silence itself is worth noting. Whatever happened in that palace, someone with both the access and the motive to reach the king made certain it succeeded. A more speculative reading goes further still, tying the murder to the broader pattern of unrest already visible elsewhere in Akkadian history: the rebellion against Naram-Sin, the eventual collapse blamed on the Gutians, the curse attributed to Enlil's wrath. Under this view, Manishtushu's death is not an isolated anomaly, but an early data point in a much longer story of instability, one that the empire's official inscriptions worked continuously to paper over with claims of conquest and piety, even as the palace itself, generation after generation, proved to be a far more dangerous place than any battlefield. What actually happened inside that palace we may never know. No trial record survives, if one was ever written. No confession, no accusation, no name of a single conspirator has reached us across 4,000 years. Only a chronicler's brief, almost clinical note that the king was killed by those closest to him. It is a detail that raises more questions than it answers, about the loyalty, or the lack of it, running through the innermost chambers of the world's first empire, and about how many other silences like this one, unrecorded, unexplained, folded quietly into a single sentence of omen and portent, might still be sitting, undiscovered, inside the fragments of clay we have not yet learned to read. Before there was a Manishtushu murdered in his own palace, there was an older brother, the second king of Akkad, the man who held the throne between Sargon and Manishtushu, and whose own end, when the sources finally address it, proves just as difficult to pin down. His name was Rimush, and his story begins not with a mystery, but with a bloodbath so thoroughly documented that it stands in stark contrast to the silence that would later surround his death. Rimush inherited the throne from his father Sargon, and, almost immediately, inherited something else as well: rebellion. The Sumerian cities that would rise against Naram-Sin a generation later had, it seems, already tested the strength of the dynasty once before, under its second king. Rimush's own inscriptions, and they are unusually detailed, unusually boastful, even by the standards of Akkadian royal propaganda, describe a series of brutal campaigns to reconquer Ur, Umma, Adab, Lagash, and Kazalu, cities that appear to have thrown off Akkadian rule the moment Sargon died. The casualty figures Rimush records are staggering. In a single account, he claims to have killed over 11,000 men in the conquest of Ur and Lagash alone, and taken thousands more captive. Whether these numbers reflect literal accuracy or the exaggerated boasting typical of royal inscriptions, the message they were meant to send is unmistakable. This was not a gentle king. This was a ruler who understood, from the very outset of his reign, that the empire his father built was held together by force, and who was prepared to apply that force without hesitation. And then, after years of documented, almost obsessively recorded warfare, the sources simply go quiet. We know Rimush died. We know, from king lists and later chronicle fragments, that his reign lasted somewhere between 7 and 9 years. We know his brother Manishtushu succeeded him. What we do not know, what no inscription, no chronicle, no fragment of Akkadian record tells us directly, is how he died. The clue we do have comes, again, from that same genre of later omen literature that would eventually record his brother's murder. A brief entry noting that Rimush was killed by his own courtiers, struck down, according to one especially vivid tradition preserved in much later Mesopotamian sources, with clay tablets or perhaps stone seals wielded as makeshift weapons. An oddly specific and almost theatrical detail for a text this sparse, and one that has understandably attracted attention from historians ever since. Was Rimush truly murdered with the very instruments of the administration he ruled, cut down amid the tools of record-keeping and bureaucracy that had made the Akkadian state function in the first place? Or is this a detail added later, a poetic irony too satisfying for some later scribe to resist, regardless of what actually happened in the room where the king died? The parallel to his brother's fate is difficult to ignore, and it raises the same unanswered question this chronicle of Akkadian kings keeps circling back to. Two brothers, ruling in succession, both meeting their ends, if these fragmentary sources are to be trusted, at the hands of the very court officials meant to serve them. Is this coincidence? Two unrelated palace tragedies that later tradition simply happened to record in similar terms? Or does it suggest something more troubling about the nature of the Akkadian court itself? An institution where loyalty to the throne was, from the dynasty's second generation onward, never quite as stable as the triumphant inscriptions wanted the world to believe. Some historians have proposed a more specific reading, that Rimush's brutal suppression of the early rebellions, however necessary it may have seemed for holding the empire together, generated exactly the kind of resentment among Sumerian elites, and perhaps even within his own Akkadian court, that could eventually curdle into conspiracy. A king who kills 11,000 men to secure his throne, this reasoning goes, does not necessarily make himself safer by doing so. He simply relocates the danger, from the battlefield to the palace corridor, from open war to something quieter and far harder to see coming. Others urge more caution, noting that the omen literature describing Rimush's death was composed centuries after the fact, by scribes working within a genre defined by portent and pattern rather than strict historical record-keeping. The similarity between Rimush's and Manishtushu's ends may say less about what actually happened in either case, and more about how later Mesopotamian tradition liked to imagine its early kings, as men whose triumphs were matched, almost narratively, by private, hidden downfalls, a kind of moral symmetry imposed after the fact onto two deaths that may, in reality, have had nothing to do with one another. We are left, then, with a king who conquered cities by the thousands, and left behind some of the most detailed military inscriptions of the entire Akkadian period, and who nonetheless vanishes from the historical record at the exact moment his own story becomes most personal, the moment of his death. What happened in that room, if there was a room at all? Who moved against him, and why, after years of victory upon victory, would his own household turn against the king who had done so much to secure it? The tablets that might once have held the answer, if they were ever written at all, remain buried somewhere beneath 4,000 years of Mesopotamian silt, alongside, perhaps, the very palace where Rimush breathed his last. That wooden collar, the one Sargon is said to have placed around Lugalzagesi's neck before leading him to Nippur, does not vanish from the story once its owner disappears from the record. Objects like it, stocks, yokes, restraints built for the specific purpose of parading a defeated enemy, appear again and again in the inscriptions of the kings who followed, and nowhere more vividly than in the campaign records of Sargon's second son and eventual successor. a king whose own reign began in blood and whose own end, when it finally came, would prove just as difficult to pin down as his predecessors. His name was Rimush, and if Lugalzagesi's fate is a mystery of silence, Rimush's early reign is almost the opposite problem. A mystery buried not in absence, but in an overwhelming, almost unsettling abundance of detail. Rimush inherited the throne from Sargon and, it seems, inherited open rebellion along with it. The moment the old king died, several of the very cities he had spent his reign subduing, Ur, Umma, Adab, Lagash, Kazalu, rose up, apparently believing a change of ruler meant an opportunity to shake off Akkadian control entirely. Rimush's own inscriptions, remarkably candid and remarkably violent even by the standards of Mesopotamian royal boasting, describe his response in exacting, almost bureaucratic detail. In his account of retaking Ur and Lagash alone, he claims a death toll exceeding 11,000 men, with thousands more taken captive. Similar figures appear in his records of the campaigns against Kazelu and Edab. Whether these numbers reflect precise casualty counts or the kind of inflated boasting expected of a young king desperate to prove his legitimacy, the sheer specificity of the reporting is itself notable. This was not a ruler content to let victory speak for itself in vague terms. This was a king who wanted every scribe, every rival, every future reader of his inscriptions to understand exactly how thoroughly rebellion would be answered. And then, after years of this meticulously documented brutality, the record simply stops. We know Rimush's reign lasted somewhere between 7 and 9 years, depending on which version of the king list is consulted. We know his brother Manishtushu succeeded him. What we do not know, what no contemporary inscription tells us directly, is how his reign actually ended. The one clue available to us comes, again, from that same body of later Omen literature that would eventually record his brother's death as well. A brief notation, composed centuries after the fact, stating that Rimush was killed by his own courtiers. One especially vivid strand of later Mesopotamian tradition adds a detail so specific it has puzzled historians ever since, that the king was struck down with clay tablets, or perhaps stone cylinder seals, objects associated not with warfare, but with the machinery of administration itself, wielded as improvised weapons inside his own palace. Is this detail history, or is it metaphor sharpened into narrative? A king who ruled through bureaucratic conquest, whose inscriptions read like military ledgers, killed by the very instruments of record-keeping his empire depended on. The symbolism is almost too neat, and that neatness is precisely what makes historians cautious. Omen texts were not composed as objective chronicles. They were compiled to draw connections between past events and future portents, and a detail this poetically resonant may reflect later scribal invention as easily as it might preserve authentic memory. And yet dismissing it outright requires assuming later tradition invented a specific, unusual murder weapon from nothing at all, which is its own kind of assumption. What makes Rimush's case especially difficult to resolve is the total absence of any political context for his death, unlike Naram-Sin, whose reign faced an open, well-documented coalition rebellion, or Manishtushu, whose obscure murder at least follows a period of stated stability. Rimush's own inscriptions give no hint of court intrigue, no whisper of factional tension, nothing beyond his relentless campaign to hold together an empire under siege from its own subject cities. Did the same brutality that secured his throne in its early years eventually turn his own household against him? Officials, perhaps, who had grown weary of a king whose answer to every challenge was overwhelming, exhausting force? Or was his death entirely unconnected to policy, a matter of personal ambition among rivals within the palace, unrelated to anything recorded in the surviving inscriptions. Some historians have proposed a third possibility worth sitting with, that the near-identical fates attributed to Rimush and Manishtushu, both killed, according to later tradition, by their own courtiers, may say less about either individual reign and more about how later Mesopotamian scribes chose to remember the entire Akkadian dynasty. A pattern of violent, unexplained palace deaths recurring across 3 successive generations could reflect genuine historical instability at the heart of the empire. Or it could reflect a kind of narrative shorthand, a way later chroniclers had of explaining, retroactively, why an empire that once seemed so powerful eventually came apart, as though its downfall had been seeded, quietly, inside its own palace walls long before any drought or any invasion from the Zagros ever occurred. No trial record survives. No name of a conspirator has reached us. The tablets, or seals, said to have ended Rimush's life have never been recovered, if they ever existed as anything other than a later scribe's dramatic flourish. What remains is a king whose military conquests were recorded with almost obsessive precision, and whose death, by contrast, survives only as a single unadorned sentence, buried inside a genre of text built for reading omens rather than preserving history. Somewhere beneath the silt that has swallowed Akkad itself, the true circumstances of Rimush's end may still be waiting, if, after 4,000 years, anything of that room or that night remains to be found at all. Silence, we have seen, is not empty. In Rimush's case, it took the shape of a single omen text sentence standing in for what may have been hours or years of court intrigue we will never fully recover. That same kind of silence, concentrated, almost deliberate in its brevity, surrounds an earlier king as well, one whose story predates Rimush, predates Sargon's entire dynasty, and whose disappearance from the record marks not the end of an empire but its very beginning. His name was Lugalzagesi, and before there was an Akkad, there was his kingdom, the last great flowering of independent Sumerian power before a new order swept it away. Lugalzagesi began his career as king of Umma, a city with a long-standing rivalry against its neighbor Lagash, a rivalry documented in some of the oldest surviving border dispute records in human history. He won that rivalry decisively, conquering Lagash and, in the process, toppling its ruler Urukagina, a king remembered for issuing what many historians consider the earliest known legal reforms aimed at protecting ordinary citizens from official abuse. From there, Lugalzagesi's ambitions only grew. His inscriptions describe him extending his authority over Uruk, which he made his capital, and eventually over Nippur, and a wide arc of southern Mesopotamia, claiming for himself, in language that would later echo strangely in Sargon's own boasts, dominion over the lands from the lower sea to the upper sea, the Persian Gulf to, in all likelihood, the Mediterranean coast. For roughly a quarter century, Lugalzagesi held something no Sumerian ruler had quite achieved before him: a genuine, if fragile, hegemony over the region's fiercely independent city-states. Then Sargon rose in the north, in a city called Kish, and Lugalzagesi's hegemony met its end. Here, the sources become unusually cooperative, at least briefly. Sargon's own inscriptions describe the decisive confrontation in specific, almost triumphant terms. Lugalzagesi was defeated in battle, captured, and led, bound at the neck in a wooden stock, a restraint designed as much for public humiliation as for physical confinement, to the gates of Nippur, where he was presented before the temple of Enlil, the god whose favor he had once claimed as the foundation of his own authority. This scene is corroborated across multiple textual traditions, and stands as one of the better documented individual events from the earliest days of the Akkadian state. A defeated king, paraded in restraints, delivered before the very God whose blessing had legitimized his rule. It is a moment built for remembering, and Mesopotamian scribes remembered it well. And it is precisely at this moment, with the drama at its peak, that the sources abandon the story entirely. What became of Lugalzagesi after his procession to Nippur? Was he killed there, at the temple threshold, in a ritualized execution meant to formally close one era of Sumerian rule and inaugurate another? Was he taken elsewhere and imprisoned, kept alive as a diminished symbol of the old order's submission? Might he even have been permitted some reduced role under the new regime, a defeated king allowed to live out his years in quiet obscurity while Sargon's city rose to prominence in his place? No inscription answers this. No later chronicle fills the gap. For a textual tradition that elsewhere shows real willingness to record the deaths, executions, and even the manner of dying of defeated rivals, the silence surrounding Lugalzagesi's specific fate is conspicuous. Historians examining this gap have generally settled on a handful of plausible readings, none conclusively provable. The most direct interpretation holds that Lugalzagesi was executed at or near Nippur, and that his public humiliation before Enlil's temple functioned as the ceremonial prelude to that execution, a pattern with parallels elsewhere in the ancient Near East, where displaying a defeated king before a major religious authority often served to demonstrate divine sanction for a change in rulership. Under this reading, the absence of an explicit record of execution is simply an accident of preservation, not evidence that the execution did not happen. Sargon's scribes may well have considered the humiliation itself the Jilu, worthy climax, with the actual killing treated as a formality not requiring separate commemoration. A second reading takes the silence more literally, suggesting that once his public defeat was complete, Lugalzagesi may have simply faded into an unrecorded captivity. His continued existence, however long it lasted, judged too politically insignificant to merit further mention once his kingdom had been absorbed and his religious legitimacy publicly stripped away in front of Nippur's priesthood. A third, more speculative possibility turns on the choice of location itself. Why present Lugalzagesi at Nippur rather than at Umma or Uruk, his own former seats of power, or at Akkad, Sargon's new capital? Some scholars have suggested this choice reflects a political calculation on Sargon's part, a need to secure the endorsement of Nippur's priesthood, the religious center whose approval carried weight across all of Sumer, regardless of which king currently held military dominance. If so, Lugalzagesi's ultimate fate may have been determined less by battlefield outcome than by a negotiated settlement with that priesthood, the terms of which have simply not survived in any form available to us today. What we are left with, in the end, is an image rather than an answer. A once great king, bound at the neck, led through the gates of the holiest city in Sumer to stand before the god he had claimed as his own protector, and then nothing. No death notice, no record of exile, no mention in any later king list of what became of him next. Did Lugalzagesi die that day at the threshold of Enlil's temple, the final casualty of Sumer's last independent age? Or did he live on somewhere in the new empire that replaced him, a forgotten man watching Akkad rise to a power his own kingdom had only briefly, imperfectly achieved? 4,000 years later, the gates of Nippur remain exactly where the story left them, closed and silent on whatever happened next. Leave the palace corridors and temple gates of Sumer now, and travel far beyond the reach of any Akkadian scribe, to a limestone cave in northern India, in the state of Meghalaya, where a formation called a stalagmite has been growing, in complete darkness, one layer at a time, for tens of thousands of years. It was here, deep inside Mamlu Cave, that geologists in the early 2000s extracted a core sample that would eventually give its name to an entire chapter of Earth's climate history, and would indirectly offer one of the most compelling physical explanations yet for why the Akkadian Empire and a surprising number of other civilizations across the ancient world collapsed at almost precisely the same moment. The stalagmite itself is unassuming, a slow accumulation of mineral deposits built drip by drip over millennia, each microscopic layer recording, with remarkable fidelity, the chemistry of the rainfall that fed it. By analyzing the ratios of oxygen isotopes locked within these layers, researchers can reconstruct, with a precision no written record could ever match, the rainfall patterns of a given region stretching back tens of thousands of years. And in this particular sample, at a depth corresponding to roughly 2200 BC, something changes abruptly. The isotope ratios shift sharply, indicating a sudden, dramatic weakening of the Indian monsoon. A disruption significant enough and sustained enough that in 2018 the International Union of Geological Sciences formally adopted this exact cave layer as the reference point defining a new geological age. The Megalayan, our current age, beginning precisely at the moment this climate event occurred. This event has come to be known, among climate scientists and archaeologists alike, as the 4.2 Kiloyear event, and its significance extends far beyond a single cave in India. Because researchers investigating soil cores, lake sediments, and pollen records across an extraordinary range of locations, northern Syria, the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, the Indus Valley, even parts of China, have found evidence of a strikingly similar disruption occurring at almost exactly the same time. A global, or at least hemispheric, shift toward aridity, persisting for roughly 2 to 3 centuries, arriving right around 2200 BC. And 2200 BC, as we have already seen, sits almost precisely at the moment the Akkadian Empire began its collapse. This is not a coincidence historians discovered recently or quietly. It has become, in fact, one of the most widely cited explanations for Akkad's fall, supported by the soil core data from Tel Leilan in northern Syria that first drew scholarly attention to the connection in the early 1990s. Evidence showing a sudden spike in wind-blown dust and a corresponding abandonment of agricultural settlements dated to almost exactly this period. The mainstream historical narrative at this point is fairly settled. A severe, sustained drought struck the region the Akkadian Empire depended on for its grain supply. Its irrigation systems failed to compensate for a shift. This dramatic agricultural collapse triggered administrative collapse, and the empire's authority unraveled from the inside even before Gutian incursions and internal rebellions delivered whatever blows came after. But here is where the story widens into something stranger, and considerably harder to explain through Mesopotamia alone. Because the Akkadian Empire was not the only civilization that came apart during this same narrow window of centuries. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramid builders, collapsed into the fragmented, unstable period historians call the First Intermediate Period at almost precisely the same time, amid textual accounts describing famine so severe that later Egyptian literature would remember it for centuries afterward. In the Indus Valley, the sophisticated urban civilization, centered on cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, began a long, still poorly understood decline during this same era. Its great cities gradually depopulated. In China, some researchers have connected this same climatic disruption to the semi-legendary transition between the Xia and Shang dynasties and to widespread flooding traditions preserved in later Chinese texts. 3, possibly 4, entirely independent, geographically distant civilizations, separated by thousands of miles, with no meaningful contact between them, all showing signs of serious disruption within roughly the same 2 to 3 century span. Why would climate disruption on this scale, across such vastly separated regions, occur simultaneously? This is where mainstream climatology begins to intersect with genuinely open scientific questions. Some researchers have pointed to shifts in North Atlantic Ocean circulation patterns as a possible trigger, capable of producing cascading effects on monsoon systems and rainfall patterns across the globe. Others have investigated the possibility of a major volcanic event, one whose sulfate aerosols, injected into the upper atmosphere, could have altered global temperature and precipitation patterns for years or even decades. Though identifying a single eruption large enough and precisely enough dated to account for the full scope of the 4.2 Kiloyear event has proven difficult, with no fully confirmed candidate yet agreed upon across the scientific literature. Still, others have proposed that the event resulted not from one dramatic trigger, but from an unfortunate convergence of ordinary climate variability, in which naturally occurring fluctuations across several independent systems happened to align in a way that amplified their combined effect far beyond what any single factor could have produced alone. And here, at the edges of the more speculative literature, a handful of researchers have raised the question of whether solar activity played a role, whether a documented decline in solar output during this period might have compounded the disruption, shifting global atmospheric circulation patterns in ways still not fully modeled by current climate science. This remains a minority position, and one many specialists treat with considerable caution, given how difficult it is to disentangle solar influence from the many other variables at play across a period this ancient. But the fact that this question remains genuinely open, that even now, with satellite data and sediment cores and ice cores from opposite ends of the planet, scientists have not fully agreed on what triggered the 4.2 Kiloyear event, says something remarkable about the limits of what we can reconstruct, even with modern tools, about a climate crisis old enough to have unmade the world's first empire. What, then, actually happened to the Earth's climate system around 2200 BC, with enough force to help bring down pyramid builders in Egypt, city planners in the Indus Valley, and the empire Sargon built from nothing at the edge of the Euphrates, all in the same narrow window of centuries, on opposite sides of the world? The stalagmite in Mamlu Cave has given science a name for this crisis, and a fairly precise date. It has not yet given anyone a fully settled answer for why it happened at all, leaving open the question of whether the true cause of Akkad's fall was ever really written by a Mesopotamian scribe in the first place, or whether it was written long before any human hand touched clay, in the slow dripping mineral memory of a cave half a world away. It is worth pausing here for a moment to consider what we have actually been doing across this investigation. We have been searching for a city with no known address, an emperor with no known birth, a series of deaths with no known culprits, a climate catastrophe with no fully agreed cause. Piece by piece, we have been assembling a portrait of the Akkadian world almost entirely from the outside in, from later chronicles, from omen texts, from soil cores extracted continents away. But what if, somewhere beneath the sands of modern Syria, an entire archive had survived that let us hear this world speak in its own words, from its own moment, uncensored by centuries of later retelling? As it turns out, one did, and its story is its own kind of vanishing act. In 1964, an Italian archaeological team led by Paolo Mattiai began excavating a large, unremarkable mound near the modern Syrian village of Mardik, roughly 35 miles southwest of Aleppo. For over a decade, the work proceeded at the careful, incremental pace typical of Near Eastern archaeology. Walls uncovered, pottery catalogued, little to suggest anything beyond a moderately significant regional settlement. Then, in 1975, the excavation reached a room in what had clearly once been a royal palace, and inside that room, still resting largely in the order in which they had once stood on wooden shelves that had long since rotted away, lay an archive of approximately 1,700 complete clay tablets, along with tens of thousands of additional fragments. The city the team had found was Ebla, and the tablets they had uncovered would, almost overnight, force historians to rewrite their understanding of the 3rd millennium BC. What the Ebla archive revealed was staggering in scope. Here was a Syrian kingdom, previously known to modern scholarship only through a handful of passing references in Mesopotamian and Egyptian sources, that turned out to have been an economic and political power in its own right. A city whose administrative reach, according to its own records, extended across a network of trade and diplomatic relationships stretching from Mesopotamia to Anatolia to the Levant, with a bureaucracy sophisticated enough to track textile production, grain distribution, and diplomatic correspondence across thousands of individual transactions. The tablets were written in a previously unknown Semitic language, now called Eblate, closely related to Akkadian, but distinct enough to represent its own branch of the Semitic language family. A discovery that reshaped scholarly understanding of how widely Semitic languages had already diversified by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. For a brief period after their discovery, some scholars even proposed connections between the Ebla texts and figures and places named in the Hebrew Bible, a claim that generated considerable public excitement and, in time, considerable scholarly caution, as more careful analysis found many of the proposed connections far less certain than initial reports had suggested. And then, according to the archive itself, sometime around 2300 BC, during a period that overlaps closely with the height of Sargon's, or possibly Naram-Sin's Akkadian power, Ebla was destroyed. The palace archive, remarkably, survived precisely because the building that housed it burned. The intense heat of the fire that consumed the palace's wooden shelving baked the unfired clay tablets solid, preserving them for over 4,000 years in the very destruction that ended the archive's active use. The city was violently ended in a single, catastrophic event, its administrative center reduced to ash, its tablets sealed by fire into permanence even as the kingdom that produced them ceased, for centuries, to exist. Who destroyed Ebla? Here, mainstream scholarship points most often toward the Akkadian Empire itself. Inscriptions attributed to Sargon and, more explicitly, to Naram-Sin claim campaigns reaching Ebla and the surrounding Syrian region. Naram-Sin's own texts boast of conquering Armanum and Ebla, a claim that has led many historians to conclude that the destruction layer uncovered in the palace archive represents the physical evidence of an Akkadian military campaign, one more data point in the long, violent expansion of the world's first empire. But the identification is not as settled as it might first appear. Some scholars have questioned whether the Ebla named in Naram-Sin's inscriptions is definitively the same site excavated at Tel Mardik, given that ancient place names sometimes referred to multiple locations across different periods, and given that the archaeological dating of Ebla's destruction, while broadly consistent with the Akkadian period, has not been pinned down with enough precision to eliminate every alternative. Could the destroyer have been a different power entirely? A rival Syrian kingdom, a coalition of local enemies even, as some have speculated, unrest connected to the same broader instability that would later topple Akkad itself? The tablets that might resolve this question directly say remarkably little about the circumstances of their own city's end. Archives, by their nature, record the functioning of a bureaucracy, not the manner of its final destruction. What remains, in the end, is a kingdom that spoke for itself in extraordinary detail for perhaps a century and a half, and then, in a single violent afternoon, whose full cause we still cannot name with certainty, went silent, its language undeciphered until the 20th century, its destroyer debated even now, its archive preserved only by the very fire that ended it. Was Ebla one more casualty of Akkadian ambition, another conquest absorbed into Naram-Sin's boasts of empire? Or does its ruin belong to a story we have not yet fully uncovered, one written somewhere in the 17,000 fragments that still, after 50 years of study, have not all been read? Beneath Tel Mardik, the ash that preserved Ebla's voice has not yet finished telling us everything it knows. Every archive we have examined so far has spoken to us second-hand, through royal boasts, omen compilations, chronicles written generations after the fact. But there was one voice from the Akkadian world that spoke, remarkably in the first person, in verses composed by a named individual whose personal identity we can trace with a confidence almost unheard of for this period. She was Sargon's own daughter, and her name was Enheduanna. Installed by her father as High Priestess of the Moon, god Nana at the Temple of Ur, Enheduanna held one of the most powerful religious offices in the entire empire, a position that placed a member of the new Akkadian royal family at the head of one of Sumer's oldest and most sacred cults, binding the conquered south to the conquering north through ritual as much as through military garrison. It was, by any measure, a shrewd political appointment. But Enheduanna's importance to history extends well beyond the office she held. She is, according to the most widely accepted scholarly consensus, the earliest author in world literature, whose name we know, the composer of a body of hymns and poems preserved on tablets copied for centuries after her death. Work that includes some of the most personal, emotionally direct writing to survive from the ancient Near East. Among these compositions is a hymn known today as the Exaltation of Inanna, and it is here that the mystery properly begins. In this text, Enheduanna describes, in vivid and anguished language, being driven from her temple and her office by a man named Lugalzagesi, cast out of the sanctuary she had served, forced into what she describes as a kind of exile, wandering and stripped of the status her birth and appointment had granted her. She calls upon the goddess Inanna directly, pleading for restoration, describing her suffering in terms unusually intimate for a genre otherwise dominated by formal, impersonal praise poetry. It is, in essence, a first-hand political testimony, composed by a woman who lived through the events she describes, and it raises a question the surrounding historical record answers only in fragments. Who was Lugalzagesi, and what precisely happened to drive the daughter of the world's first emperor from her own temple? The most widely accepted historical reading connects Enheduanna's exile to the same wave of unrest that convulsed the Akkadian Empire during the reign of her brother, Naram-Sin. Specifically, the Great Rebellion we have already examined, in which cities across the Sumerian heartland rose in coordinated revolt against Akkadian rule. Under this interpretation, Lugalzagesi may have been a local ruler or usurper at Ur, who seized the opportunity of that broader uprising to expel the Akkadian-appointed priestess and reclaim the temple, and by extension the city's religious authority, for a non-Akkadian faction. Enheduanna's hymn, in this reading, becomes a kind of political survival document as much as a devotional one, a plea to Inanna composed, perhaps, with the very practical hope of mobilizing support, human or divine, for her restoration. This explanation fits the broader pattern of instability we have traced across Naram-Sin's reign, and most historians find it the most economical reading of the evidence available. But the hymn itself resists being reduced entirely to political documentation. Its language is dense with personal anguish, its imagery drawn as much from individual suffering as from any specific political grievance, and this has led some scholars to read the text as operating on more than one level simultaneously. Part historical record, part deeply personal spiritual crisis, in which Enheduanna processes her expulsion not merely as a loss of political office, but as a genuine rupture in her relationship with the divine order she had spent her life serving. There is also the question of what happened afterward. Later tradition, and the survival of Enheduanna's compositions in scribal curricula for over 500 years after her death, suggests she was eventually restored to her position, her authority, and her literary reputation ultimately outlasting whatever crisis drove her from Ur. But the specific mechanism of that restoration is, like so much else in this story, absent from the direct record. Did Naram-Sin's eventual victory over the rebellion automatically restore his sister to her temple? Did Enheduanna's own political or religious standing play some independent role in securing her return? Did the very act of composing and circulating the exaltation of Inanna function as a deliberate strategy, a literary campaign aimed at rallying support for her restoration, one that we are perhaps still reading, 4,000 years later, exactly as she intended it to be read? A more speculative line of inquiry looks past the political explanation entirely and asks whether Enheduanna's exile reflects tensions specific to her unusual position. A woman occupying an office of immense religious authority, appointed not through the traditional channels of Sumerian temple hierarchy, but through the direct intervention of a foreign conqueror's dynasty. Under this reading, Lugalzagesi's rebellion may have targeted her not simply as a symbol of Akkadian political control, but specifically because her presence represented an unprecedented and perhaps deeply unsettling break with established religious tradition, a woman whose authority derived from imperial appointment rather than the older, more organic forms of religious legitimacy Ur's priesthood had recognized for centuries. If so, her exile speaks to a friction not just between conquered and conqueror, but between two entirely different conceptions of how sacred authority ought to be granted and held. What we are left with, in the end, is a voice remarkably intact across 4,000 years, more intact, in some ways, than the political history surrounding it. We can read Enheduanna's own words describing her suffering, her fear, her plea for restoration, with a directness no royal inscription or omen text has offered us anywhere else in this investigation. And yet the man who drove her out remains almost entirely unknown beyond his name. His motives inferred rather than documented. His fate after Naram-Sin's eventual victory never recorded at all. Did Enheduanna's hymn survive because it worked? Because a priestess's carefully composed words genuinely helped restore her to her temple? Or does its survival owe less to political consequence and more to the simple, enduring power of a woman's testimony, preserved by scribes for 5 centuries, not because it changed anything, but because no one who read it could bring themselves to let it be forgotten? From the temple precincts of Ur, where Enheduanna once served and was once cast out, let the story travel outward now, following the same trade routes her father's merchants once used, north across the Anatolian plateau, east toward the Indus, south along the Persian Gulf toward lands the Akkadians called Magan and Meluha. Because Sargon's empire, as vast as the historical record confirms it to have been, may have been considerably larger still, if a body of later, more legendary campaign texts is to be believed at all. The confirmed core of Sargon's military record is not in question. His own contemporary inscriptions, corroborated by administrative texts and later king lists, describe a ruler who conquered the whole of Sumer, campaigned into Elam to the east, and extended Akkadian influence into northern Mesopotamia and parts of Syria. Achievements substantial enough on their own to justify his reputation as the founder of the first true empire in human history. This much rests on solid documentary ground. But alongside these confirmed campaigns, a separate body of later Mesopotamian literature describes military ventures of a far more extraordinary and far more difficult to verify character. Chief among these is a text scholars call the Sargon geography, along with a related composition known as Sargon, King of Battle, both surviving only in copies made centuries, in some cases well over 1,000 years after Sargon's death. These texts describe campaigns reaching deep into Anatolia, allegedly launched to protect Akkadian merchants trading in the city of Purushanda, and further claim Sargon's authority extended, at least nominally, across an almost impossibly vast territory. One text goes so far as to enumerate distant lands paying homage to Akkad, describing a reach that, if taken literally, would place Sargon's influence across nearly the entire breadth of the ancient Near East and beyond. How should a historian treat claims like these? The honest answer is, with considerable, structured caution, but not with outright dismissal. On one hand, the pattern is a familiar one in ancient literature. Later, scribes, writing centuries after an empire's founding, had every incentive to inflate the achievements of a dynasty's founder, retroactively projecting the boundaries of their own political imagination onto a figure distant enough in time to no longer be able to contradict them. The later Sargon legends share this quality with epic literature more broadly, the tendency for a culture's foundational figures to accumulate achievements over time, each generation of storytellers adding a little more to the legend until the original, more modest historical figure becomes difficult to locate beneath the accumulated myth. On the other hand, the core commercial motive behind the Anatolian campaign described in these texts is not, in itself, implausible. Independent archaeological evidence, cylinder seals, trade goods, and administrative texts recovered from sites across Anatolia and dating to roughly this period does confirm that long-distance trade networks connecting Mesopotamia to Anatolia's metal-rich regions were active and valuable during the era of Akkadian expansion. A military expedition launched to protect merchants operating along these routes would fit comfortably within the economic logic of an empire whose wealth, as we saw in its very first chapter, depended heavily on long-distance trade reaching from the Indus to the Mediterranean. Is it possible that a real, if smaller scale, Anatolian campaign occurred, and that later scribes simply exaggerated its scope and its stated purpose over centuries of retelling? Many historians consider this the most balanced reading available. What makes this question especially difficult to resolve is the near-total absence of independent Anatolian textual sources from this specific period capable of confirming or denying an Akkadian military presence directly. Anatolia, in the later 3rd millennium BC, has left us a comparatively thin written record of its own, meaning that whatever happened between Sargon's forces and the city of Purushanda, if anything happened at all, exists for us almost entirely through the lens of Mesopotamian retelling, composed generations after the fact in a genre already known for blending genuine historical memory with heroic embellishment. At the more speculative edge of this discussion, a handful of researchers have pointed to the extraordinary geographic reach claimed in the Sargon geography text and asked whether it might preserve, in however distorted a form, authentic knowledge of trade contacts extending even further than conventionally assumed, into regions of Central Asia or the broader Iranian plateau that mainstream Akkadian archaeology has not yet confirmed through direct excavation. This remains very much a minority position, resting more on the tantalizing scope of the text's claims than on any independently verified archaeological find, and most specialists continue to treat the document primarily as a later literary composition rather than a reliable military record. But the fact that Akkadian trade contacts with Meluha, most likely the Indus Valley civilization, are independently confirmed through archaeological finds of Indus seals in Mesopotamian contexts does suggest that Sargon's world was, at minimum, considerably more interconnected than his core. Verified military campaigns alone might indicate. We are left, then, with two overlapping pictures of the same king. One, drawn from contemporary inscriptions, shows a formidable but geographically bounded conqueror, unifying Sumer and extending Akkadian power into Elam and parts of Syria. The other, drawn from texts composed centuries later, shows a ruler whose reach allegedly extended across nearly the entire known world of his era, protecting merchants as far away as central Anatolia and receiving the notional submission of lands whose names barely survive in any other source. Which version reflects the man who actually lived? Perhaps neither, entirely, perhaps both, in fragments. And perhaps somewhere between the confirmed borders of Sargon's empire and the vast, legendary borders later scribes imagined for him, lies a set of real campaigns, genuine journeys into distant, half-forgotten territory that clay alone, buried and unread, is still waiting to confirm. A generation would pass before the last king of Akkad's founding line took the throne. A generation in which the empire's borders, so expansively imagined in the legendary campaign texts we have just examined, began, in the sober record of contemporary inscriptions, to visibly contract. His name was Shar-kali-sharri, son of Naram-Sin, and his reign marks one of the strangest chapters in the entire Akkadian story. Not because so little is known about him, but because what we do know describes an empire simultaneously functioning with remarkable administrative sophistication and unraveling, piece by piece, before his own eyes. Shar-kali-sharri inherited, on paper, the largest and most powerful state the ancient Near East had yet produced. The empire his grandfather Sargon had founded. His uncle Rimush had violently defended. His father Naram-Sin had expanded to its greatest territorial extent and crowned with claims of living godhood. And for a portion of his reign, the administrative machinery of that empire continued to function with real sophistication. Economic texts from this period show a bureaucracy still capable of tracking grain distribution, managing temple offerings, and administering a complex tax and tribute system across a wide territory. Shar-kali-sharri's own inscriptions record building projects at Nippur, including work on the temple of Enlil, the same temple, tradition would later claim, whose earlier destruction by Naram-Sin had brought down Enlil's curse upon the entire dynasty. Was this an act of pious restoration? A king consciously working to repair the damage attributed to his father's sacrilege? Later tradition, particularly the curse of Akkad, certainly reads it that way, describing Shar-kali-sharri as a king who restored the great offering places and pleaded before Enlil for the life of Akkad. If so, it suggests that the empire's rulers, or at least its scribes, understood their political troubles, at least partly in religious terms, as a debt that needed repaying to the gods rather than a set of purely administrative failures requiring purely administrative solutions. And yet, even as this religious restoration was apparently underway, the military record of Shar-kali-sharri's reign tells a very different story than that of his predecessors. Where Naram-Sin's inscriptions boast of campaigns reaching the Mediterranean and Anatolia, Shar-kali-sharri's confirmed military actions are notably more defensive, more local, and considerably less triumphant in tone. His inscriptions describe battles against Elamites, against Amorites, a term for the pastoral peoples of the Syrian and Arabian desert fringes, beginning to press more insistently against Mesopotamia's western frontier during this period, and, tellingly, against the Gutians themselves, the same highland people later tradition would blame for the empire's ultimate collapse. One inscription even records a Gutian king captured and presumably paraded in the traditional manner, an apparent Akkadian victory. But victories of this kind, however genuine, read differently in the context of a reign that never manages to fully extinguish the threats it claims to have defeated. Where earlier Akkadian kings fought campaigns of conquest and expansion, Shar-kali-sharri appears to be fighting campaigns of containment, holding a perimeter that, despite periodic victories, seems to be pulling inward around him with each passing year. Here is where the central enigma of his reign comes into focus. The Sumerian king list, that famously unreliable but historically important compilation of Mesopotamian rulers, includes a peculiar note immediately following its entry on Shar-kali-sharri, a question embedded directly in the text itself, asking, who was king, who was not king? A line generally interpreted as reflecting a period of such severe political chaos and rapid, contested succession that the scribes compiling the list, working centuries later, could no longer confidently reconstruct who had actually held power, or in what order, or for how long. Following this line, the king list provides a rapid, almost dizzying succession of the additional names: Igigi, Nanam, Imi, Elulu, 4 kings said to have reigned a combined total of only a few years, before finally settling on a period of Gutian dominance over the region. What actually happened during and immediately after Shar-kali-sharri's reign to produce this kind of scribal confusion? This is where mainstream historical reconstruction gives way to genuinely open debate, because the sources from this specific window of Akkadian history are thinner, more fragmentary, and more difficult to reconcile with one another than for almost any other period in the dynasty's 2-century existence. The most widely accepted explanation holds that Shar-kali-sharri's reign represents the period during which the structural pressures we have traced throughout this investigation, the friction between Akkadian central authority and the traditionally independent Sumerian city-states first exposed by the Great Rebellion, the climatic disruption of the 4.2 Kiloyear event beginning to take its agricultural toll, increasing pressure from Amorite groups along the western frontier, and mounting incursions from Gutian highlanders to the east, all began to converge simultaneously, faster than any single king, however administratively capable, could manage. Under this reading, Shar-kali-sharri was not a weak or incompetent ruler. His temple restorations and military campaigns suggest a king actively working to hold his inheritance together. He was, rather, a capable ruler, caught at the exact moment multiple independent crises arrived at once, a convergence his grandfather and father, ruling in more stable decades, never had to face in combination. A second line of interpretation focuses more specifically on the succession chaos implied by the king list's confused entries, and asks whether the empire's collapse was driven less by external pressure and more by an internal succession crisis, perhaps triggered by Shar-kali-sharri's death without a clearly established heir, or by competing claims among rival branches of the royal family, each backed by different factions within the court or different provincial power bases. If Manishtushu and Rimush had genuinely been murdered by their own courtiers, as the Omen literature suggests, then a pattern of court instability predating Shar-kali-sharri by 2 full generations would provide a plausible internal mechanism for exactly this kind of rapid, contested succession once his own reign ended. 4 kings in a handful of years is not the signature of a stable transfer of power. It is the signature of a court or several rival courts, tearing at the same crown from multiple directions simultaneously, with no faction strong enough to hold it for long. A third, somewhat more speculative reading questions whether the king list's confusion reflects not 4 rapidly succeeding kings ruling one unified Akkadian state, but rather a period of genuine political fragmentation, in which several claimants ruled simultaneously over different, shrinking portions of what had once been a unified empire. Rival kings in different cities, each claiming legitimate Akkadian succession, with the king list's later compilers, working from incomplete or contradictory regional records, simply stringing these overlapping, competing reigns together into a single, sequential list that never actually existed in that linear form. If true, this would mean the empire did not so much fall as splinter, its final years spent not under one embattled king but under several, each ruling a fragment of Sargon's original territory, none commanding the whole. There is also a puzzle embedded in Shar-kali-sharri's own title. Unlike his father Naram-Sin, who had claimed the status of a living god and the title King of the Four Quarters of the World, Shar-kali-sharri's own inscriptions show him adopting more modest language, referring to himself in some texts simply as King of Akkad, rather than claiming universal dominion. Some historians read this as a deliberate and telling retreat, a king consciously scaling back the grandiose religious and political claims of his father, perhaps in direct response to the resentment those claims had generated during the Great Rebellion, perhaps as a pragmatic acknowledgement that an empire visibly contracting in practice could no longer credibly claim universal dominion in its royal titulary. If so, it would suggest a ruler keenly, even painfully aware of his empire's diminished circumstances, choosing honesty over the kind of triumphant propaganda his predecessors had so freely employed, a choice that, whatever its motivations, has left us with a far less boastful and consequently far less informative body of inscriptions to work from than we have for any king before him. What makes Shar-kali-sharri's reign so genuinely difficult to reconstruct in the end is not a total absence of evidence, of the kind that shrouds Lugalzagesi's final fate or Rimush's murder. It is, instead, an evidence base that is unusually contradictory, even by the standards of this investigation. A king who builds temples and restores offerings even as his borders visibly shrink, who wins battles against Elamites and Gutians alike, and yet leaves behind a kingdom so unstable that later scribes could not agree on who ruled after him. A ruler whose own chosen title suggests a man clear-eyed about his empire's decline, even as the specific mechanics of that decline, and the fate that met him personally at its end, remain entirely unrecorded. Did Shar-kali-sharri die of natural causes, the last king to rule a still recognizable, if diminished, Akkadian state before it fractured beyond repair? Or did his death itself mark the beginning of the very succession crisis the king list struggles so visibly to describe? A king whose passing left no clear heir strong enough to hold together an empire already straining under drought, rebellion, and invasion from every direction at once. Somewhere in the gap between his father's godhood and the chaotic list of near-forgotten names that follow him, an entire final chapter of Akkadian history seems to have gone missing. Not erased by any single dramatic catastrophe, but worn away, gradually and unevenly, in exactly the way an empire built too quickly, across too vast a territory, might reasonably be expected to come apart. Whether that account will ever be recovered from beneath 4,000 years of silt is, like so much else in Akkad's story, a question the ground itself has not yet answered. That same battered document, the Sumerian king list, the one that names 21 shadowy Gutian kings in a sequence historians still can't fully trust, contains, just a few entries earlier, another troubling gap. Immediately after the reign of Shar-kali-sharri, the last widely acknowledged strong king of Akkad, the list itself seems to lose confidence. Different versions of the document disagree, sometimes wildly, about what happened next. And that disagreement, preserved in clay for over 4,000 years, marks the beginning of one of the murkiest transitions in early Mesopotamian history. Shar-kali-sharri ruled Akkad for roughly 25 years, inheriting an empire already strained by the aftershocks of his father Naram-Sin's turbulent reign. His own inscriptions describe him defending Akkad's borders against Amorite incursions from the west and Gutian pressure from the east, the same peoples explored in the last two chapters of this investigation, converging on the empire almost simultaneously, as though its enemies had somehow sensed the exact moment of its weakening. He held the empire together more or less for a generation, and then, around 2193 BC, he died, and what followed is where the historical record fractures almost as thoroughly as the empire itself. The Sumerian king list offers a line that has puzzled historians for over a century. After Shar-kali-sharri, it asks, almost rhetorically, who was king, who was not king. It's an extraordinary admission from a document otherwise committed to presenting an unbroken chain of legitimate succession. 4 names follow in some versions: Igigi, Nanum, Imi, and Elulu, each said to have reigned for mere months, sometimes only weeks. In a scramble, the text itself seems unable or unwilling to fully untangle. Were these 4 genuine claimants to the Akkadian throne, cycling through power in rapid, violent succession? Rival warlords, each briefly seizing the capital before being overthrown in turn? Or does the scribal uncertainty suggest something else? A period so chaotic that even contemporary record keepers struggled to agree on who actually held legitimate authority at any given moment, writing down rumor and rival claims alongside verified fact, unable to fully separate one from the other. Mainstream historians generally read this as a straightforward, if violent, succession crisis, the natural consequence of a weakened central government, external pressure from Gutian raids, and probably factional infighting among Akkadian elites and provincial power brokers, some of whom we've already met in earlier chapters of this investigation, their own fates left unresolved in the archive. It's a pattern seen in collapsing states throughout history. When a strong central authority falls, multiple claimants often emerge simultaneously, each controlling a fragment of the former territory, each proclaiming legitimacy the others refuse to recognize. Under this reading, the 4 rapid kings following Shar-kali-sharri weren't necessarily illegitimate or mysterious at all, simply unlucky, ruling during a window too brief and too chaotic to leave much beyond their names. And yet a genuine puzzle remains embedded even in that reasonable explanation. Why does the documentation for this specific crisis feel so much thinner than for other, comparably chaotic periods in Mesopotamian history? Akkadian scribes, as established in earlier chapters, were nothing if not thorough record keepers. Even minor administrative disputes between private citizens over field boundaries survive in extraordinary detail. But for a crisis at the very center of imperial power, the collapse of the ruling dynasty itself, the record offers little beyond a handful of names and an admission of scribal confusion. Some archaeologists have proposed that the administrative center at Akkad, the city itself, may have suffered significant destruction or disruption during this exact period, a possibility that would neatly explain the gap, if only the city of Akkad had ever been definitively located and excavated. It has not. Akkad's precise location remains one of Mesopotamian archaeology's most persistent open questions in its own right. Its ruins never conclusively identified beneath the modern landscape of Iraq, which means the very archive that might resolve this succession crisis may be sitting, still buried and unread, somewhere beneath ground archaeologists haven't yet been permitted or able to dig. From this genuine gap, more speculative theories have grown. A minority of historians have wondered whether the king list's confusion reflects not administrative chaos, but something closer to deliberate obscuring. Later scribes, writing under subsequent dynasties, perhaps uncomfortable acknowledging how thoroughly the god-king lineage of Naram-Sin had collapsed into infighting, choosing vagueness over a fuller account that might have undermined the sacred legitimacy later rulers still claimed to inherit from Akkad's golden age. Others have pointed to the timing's uncomfortable proximity to the broader climate collapse discussed in earlier chapters, wondering whether the 4 brief kings weren't fighting primarily over political legitimacy at all, but over dwindling grain reserves in a capital already beginning to starve. a theory difficult to prove without the very archive the missing city might still contain. What we're left with, ultimately, is a single haunting line preserved on multiple copies of an ancient document. Who was king? Who was not king? It's a question the scribes themselves apparently couldn't answer with confidence 4,000 years ago, inscribed not as narrative but as genuine uncertainty, frozen permanently in clay. Perhaps somewhere beneath the still unlocated ruins of Akkad, an answer waits. Or perhaps the scribes' confusion was, even then, as close to the truth as anyone would ever get. A moment in history so genuinely unresolved that the only honest record anyone could leave behind was the shape of the not knowing itself. The Amorites were not the only outsiders Mesopotamian scribes struggled to name, categorize, and understand. Centuries before Amorite kings ever sat on Babylonian thrones, another people had already descended from beyond the frontier, not drifting in gradually from drought-stricken steppe, but arriving, according to the scribes who recorded it, like a sudden and violent judgment from the mountains. Mesopotamian texts called them the Gutians, and of the 21 kings said to have ruled in their name, we know almost nothing at all. The primary source for this dynasty is the Sumerian king list, a remarkable, semi-legendary document inscribed on clay that attempts to catalog every ruler of Mesopotamia since kingship, in the text's own words, descended from heaven. Somewhere in its accounting of the chaos following Akkad's collapse, the list records a Gutian dynasty, 21 kings reigning in succession. For a total, the text puts at 91 years. Though some king list variants report wildly different figures, occasionally stretching the era to well over a century, a discrepancy scholars still haven't fully resolved. The names themselves survive in the list, one after another: Eridupizir, Imta, Inkishush, Sarlagab, and so on. But for the vast majority of these 21 rulers, the name is the only thing that survives. No inscriptions in their own words, no temples confidently attributed to their construction, no portraits, no seals, no correspondence describing their policies, their gods, or even the language they spoke among themselves with any certainty. Where the Gutians came from is itself unsettled. Mainstream scholarship places their homeland somewhere in the Zagros Mountains, east of the Mesopotamian plain, in the region of modern-day western Iran, a mountainous, historically under-excavated area that has yielded far fewer archaeological sites than the river valleys to its west. Mesopotamian texts describe the Gutian invasion in apocalyptic terms. One later composition, The Curse of Akkad, portrays their arrival as a divine punishment unleashed upon the Akkadian Empire for the sins of Naram-Sin, describing the Gutians as beings who possess human intelligence, but the instincts of dogs, with the features of monkeys. Language scholars broadly agree reflects Mesopotamian cultural prejudice, rather than any literal description, the same kind of dehumanizing rhetoric later leveled at the Amorites, only sharper, angrier, shaped by the trauma of watching an empire collapse. But here, the mainstream explanation runs into a genuine, acknowledged problem. The archaeological record does not clearly show a Gutian civilization capable of producing what the texts describe. There are no confirmed Gutian cities, no distinct Gutian material culture, pottery styles, the burial customs, or architectural traditions has been conclusively identified and separated from the Mesopotamian cultures the Gutians supposedly ruled over. This absence has led most modern historians to a striking reassessment. The Gutian conquest was likely far less total and far less centralized than either the king list or the Curse of Akkad suggests. Rather than a unified empire replacing Akkadian rule wholesale, the Gutian period may represent a fragmented, regionalized era, Various local rulers, some genuinely of Gutian origin, others simply Mesopotamian strongmen filling a power vacuum, with the king list retroactively organizing this chaos into a tidy sequence of 21 kings for the sake of narrative continuity, the same way ancient king lists elsewhere are known to compress, embellish, or even invent rulers to preserve an unbroken chain of legitimate succession. If that reassessment is correct, a haunting question follows. How many of the 21 names on that list refer to real individuals at all? And how many are administrative fictions, names inserted to smooth over a period too chaotic, too poorly documented, or too embarrassing for later scribes to describe honestly? It's a question without a clean answer, and it only deepens with Enheduanna, the one Gutian king for whom we do have a small amount of direct evidence. A handful of inscriptions in which he claims victory over an Akkadian governor, boasting in language strikingly similar to the Akkadian royal inscriptions his people had supposedly displaced. Does this suggest the Gutians, once in power, simply adopted the administrative and rhetorical traditions of the empire they conquered, the same pattern later seen among the Amorites? Or does it hint at something more unsettling still, that Gutian king was, at least in some cases, a label of convenience applied to rulers who may have had far closer cultural ties to Akkad than the horrified language of the Curse of Akkad would ever admit? More speculative readings push further still. A minority of researchers have questioned whether Gutian functioned less as an ethnic designation and more as a catch-all term for outsiders generally, not unlike the later, equally broad use of Amorite, meaning the 21 kings might not represent a single people or dynasty at all, but a loose sequence of regional rulers from various mountain and border communities, unified only by Mesopotamian scribes' need to name an enemy. Others have pointed to the sheer brevity of most individual reigns recorded in the list, several lasting only a year or two, and wondered whether this reflects not rapid succession within a stable dynasty, but ongoing low-level civil conflict, a mountain confederation without a strong central authority, its leadership changing hands through means the Mesopotamian scribes either didn't understand or didn't care to record accurately. What survives in the end is a list of names attached to almost nothing else. No faces, no voices, no cities we can confidently walk through today. 21 kings, real or partly invented, ruling for decades that Mesopotamian civilization remembered mostly through fear and exaggeration rather than fact. Perhaps that is simply the fate of history's conquerors when their conquest fails to last, remembered only through the eyes and the grievances of the people who outlasted them. Or perhaps somewhere in the unexcavated valleys of the Zagros, a Gutian archive still waits, one that might finally let these 21 kings speak for themselves, rather than through the curses of the empire they briefly replaced. A century would pass after the last Akkadian governor vanished from the record before the empire that once employed him ceased to exist at all. And in the wreckage of that collapse, the drought-cracked fields, the abandoned administrative seats, the silence where scribes once wrote, a name begins to surface in Mesopotamian texts with increasing frequency and increasing unease. The Amorites. Picture a boundary stone, weathered and half-buried, somewhere along the ancient edge of cultivated Mesopotamian land. The line where irrigated fields gave way to steppe and desert. Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe a wall once built along a stretch of this frontier, the so-called repeller of the Amorites, constructed during the waning years of the Third Dynasty of Ur, sometime around 2034 BC. A wall built specifically to keep a people out is, by itself, a remarkable historical detail. But who exactly were the people it was meant to repel? Mainstream scholarship offers a working answer. The Amorites from Akkadian Amuru were a Semitic-speaking people originating from the region west of the Euphrates, roughly the area encompassing modern Syria. Mesopotamian scribes, writing from within their own settled irrigated civilization, described them with a mixture of anxiety and condescension. One oft-cited passage characterizes them as people who know no house, no grain, who eat their meat raw, and do not bury their dead according to proper custom. It's the language of an urban civilization describing outsiders it doesn't fully understand, and, historians generally agree, likely doesn't fully understand correctly either. The Amorites were almost certainly pastoralists, not primitives, herders, whose mobile way of life simply left a different, sparser kind of archaeological footprint than the temple and tablet civilizations of the Mesopotamian floodplain. But where, precisely, did they come from? And why did they begin pressing into Mesopotamia with such apparent force in the centuries following Akkad's collapse? The conventional narrative points to climate. The same drought that scholars now believe helped unravel the Akkadian Empire, evidenced in sediment layers pulled from beneath the Persian Gulf and the Anatolian highlands, showing a dramatic multi-century dry period beginning around 2200 BC would have devastated the steppelands west of the Euphrates even more severely than the irrigated Mesopotamian heartland. If your survival depends on rainfall for grazing land rather than river water diverted through canals, a prolonged drought doesn't just reduce your harvest, it ends your way of life entirely. Under this reading, the Amorite migrations were less an invasion than a slow, desperate drift toward the only reliable water source left in the region, the river valleys that Mesopotamian civilization had spent 1,000 years learning to control. It's a coherent explanation, grounded in genuine climate data, and most historians today find it broadly convincing. And yet it doesn't fully account for the speed or the scale of what followed. Within a few generations of the wall's construction, a wall that, by most accounts, failed to hold its intended line, Amorite names begin appearing not as raiders or refugees, but as kings. By around 1900 BC, Amorite dynasties ruled major Mesopotamian cities including Isin, Larsa, and eventually Babylon itself, where an Amorite line would produce Hammurabi, whose law code remains one of the most significant legal documents in human history. How does a people characterized in one century's texts as rootless outsiders who know no house become, within roughly 200 years, the architects of Mesopotamia's most sophisticated legal and administrative traditions? Standard historical models describe gradual settlement, intermarriage, and cultural assimilation, Amorite groups filtering into Mesopotamian cities as laborers, mercenaries, and eventually administrators, absorbing Akkadian bureaucratic culture as they climbed. It's plausible. It's also strikingly underdocumented, given how meticulously Mesopotamian scribes tended to record everything else. This gap has left room for readings that sit further from the academic mainstream. A minority of researchers have questioned whether Amorite ever described a single coherent migratory people at all, rather than a broad Mesopotamian catch-all term, not unlike how ancient Egyptian texts lumped diverse populations together under labels like Asiatics, applied to any number of distinct Western groups who shared little beyond language and a lifestyle unfamiliar to River Valley scribes. If so, the Amorite migration, as a single historical event, may be something of a retrospective illusion. Not one people moving en masse, but many smaller, unrelated movements later, flattened into a single narrative by the very civilization struggling to categorize them. It's a theory that remains contested, difficult to prove or disprove given the scarcity of texts written by the Amorites about themselves rather than about them. Then there is the more speculative question of what exactly drove the timing. drought alone explains pressure, a push toward better land. It explains less clearly why that pressure crystallized within a handful of generations into fully formed dynastic ambition. Kings who didn't simply settle but seized thrones and rewrote legal codes. Some have wondered whether Amorite groups carried with them older traditions of leadership and law, perhaps inherited from social structures that existed on the steppe long before any Mesopotamian scribe thought to write about them. Traditions that only became visible to history once their bearers finally stepped into cities equipped with the tools to record anything at all. It's an idea without firm archaeological footing, resting more on inference than evidence. But the alternative, that a supposedly rootless people improvised sophisticated statecraft within a few short generations, with almost no visible transitional record, carries its own unanswered questions. What the tablets confirm is only the outline, a wall built to keep a people out, a drought that likely broke through it anyway, and kings with foreign names sitting within a few generations on Mesopotamia's oldest thrones. The journey between those 2 points, how a people once dismissed as knowing no house, no grain, came to write some of civilization's earliest laws, remains only partly reconstructed. Perhaps the fullest account of that journey was never written down at all. Or perhaps it was, and simply lies still, somewhere beneath a mound no one has yet thought to dig. Identity, we said, rarely announces itself all at once. It accumulates, unrecorded, until something catches it and holds it still. That question of what gets held and what slips quietly out of the record does not stay behind in the story of Ebla's kings and the shadowy origins of Semitic-speaking peoples. It resurfaces just a few centuries later, in the very empire those peoples would eventually build. And this time, the vanishing isn't a matter of murky origins. It's a matter of men who were once fully documented, fully named, fully present in the record, and then were not. By the time Sargon of Akkad had unified Mesopotamia's warring city-states into history's first true empire, sometime around 2334 BC, the machinery of Semitic-speaking administration he inherited and expanded was already old, already sophisticated, already accustomed to writing everything down. Grain shipments, tax disputes, royal hymns, and appointments, the installation of provincial governors, men sent from the capital to rule conquered cities in the king's name, their authority sealed not in ambiguity but in stone, a cylinder seal carved with a name and a title pressed into wet clay to make a document official. These were not shadowy figures lost to the fog of prehistory. These were bureaucrats, fully within the light of history's first great record-keeping civilization. And yet, one by one, in province after province, they disappear. Take the governor of Ebla itself, the same city whose earlier archive raised questions about the roots of Semitic kingship. Once absorbed into the Akkadian Empire, Ebla required an administrator loyal to Akkad, and for a time the record shows one installed. Then, decades before the empire's broader collapse, the trail simply ends. No death is recorded, no successor named, no formula of transition, the kind Akkadian scribes almost always used to mark one official's departure and another's arrival. The tablets that should describe his final years, or his replacement, or even his failure, simply do not exist or have never been found. Mainstream historians offer a reasonable explanation, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Clay is fragile. Cities were sacked and rebuilt atop their own ruins, and the Gutian invasions that helped bring down the Akkadian Empire likely destroyed entire administrative archives along with the people who kept them. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Silence in the historical record, especially one this old, is often just what 4,000 years of sand and fire leave behind. but the pattern is oddly consistent for something attributed purely to accident. Across multiple provinces, the disappearances share a similar shape. Not a gradual thinning of documentation, which is what time and decay typically produce, but a clean, abrupt stop. Tablets that end mid-archive, correspondence missing its customary closing lines, seals of office that appear, under closer modern examination, to have been deliberately scored and defaced rather than simply worn down by centuries underground. Is this the ordinary violence of conquest, one administration erasing the last traces of the one before it, or something closer to ritual, an intentional undoing, not just of a man's power, but of his presence in the record altogether? The reign of Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, offers one of the more tantalizing threads. Naram-Sin was the first Akkadian king to inscribe his own name with the divine determinative, declaring himself, in writing, a living god. His inscriptions boast of crushing the Great Revolt, a coordinated uprising of rebel kings across the empire, put down in a single year through 9 decisive battles. If those rebel kings included men Akkad itself had once appointed, governors who turned against the empire that placed them in power, what became of them once defeated? Akkadian art elsewhere delights in depicting humbled enemies, prisoners in chains kneeling before a triumphant king, carved in unmistakable detail. Here, there is nothing. No relief, no inscription describing punishment. Only the quiet fact that certain names, once present in the administrative record, simply stop appearing after the revolt's supposed suppression. From this point, interpretation drifts further from consensus, into territory most Assyriologists approach with visible caution. A tablet fragment from the reign of Shar-kali-sharri, Naram-Sin's successor, describes one provincial official as having been returned to the earth by the hand of the god, a phrase found nowhere else in the surviving Akkadian corpus, and one scholars still disagree on. Is it simply an ornate way of recording a natural death? A euphemism for execution, dressed in the language of divine judgment, from an empire whose king now claimed divinity himself? Or does it gesture toward something the scribes were unwilling or unable to describe more plainly? Others point instead to the mounting evidence of catastrophic drought that gripped the region in the empire's final century. A climate collapse now documented in soil cores taken from the ancient seabed near the Akkadian heartland. Perhaps some governors did not vanish through violence or ritual erasure at all, but simply walked away from provinces that could no longer sustain governance or grain or the pretense of imperial order, their titles abandoned quietly, in cities too hungry to care who ruled them. We may never separate these explanations cleanly from one another. Perhaps some governors died in the chaos of rebellion. Perhaps others were formally erased, their seals defaced as punishment or warning. Perhaps still others simply walked into a famine-stricken landscape and were never recorded again, not erased exactly, but no longer worth writing down. What lingers is the shape of the silence itself, too patterned to be pure accident, too fragmented to be proof of anything at all. An empire that recorded almost everything left almost nothing behind for these men. And in an administration this thorough, that absence begins to feel less like loss, and more like a question the historical record itself seems reluctant to answer. Those defaced cylinder seals, the small carved stones an Akkadian governor once pressed into wet clay to declare, in an instant, exactly who he was, carry a weight beyond their size. A seal was identity made physical, a name, a title, sometimes a god's blessing, rolled into permanence. And it's that very question, how a people announces who it is and how easily that announcement can blur, fracture, or vanish, that carries us backward, before Sargon, before Akkad itself, into a mystery even older and less resolved, the true identity of the earliest Semitic kingdoms. Picture a museum case in Baghdad, or Berlin, or London. It hardly matters which, since fragments of this story are scattered across all three. Inside sits a small clay tablet, its cuneiform wedges pressed by a hand that died 4,000 years ago. The language is Akkadian, one of the earliest attested Semitic languages ever written down. But the tablet itself doesn't answer the question historians have argued over for more than a century. Where did the Semitic-speaking peoples of Mesopotamia actually come from? And when did they first become a distinct, identifiable presence in the historical record? It's a question that sounds simple. It isn't. Semitic is, first and foremost, a linguistic label, not an ethnicity, not a bloodline, not a nation. It describes a family of languages that includes Akkadian, Eblate, Amorite, and much later, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. Mainstream scholarship holds that Semitic-speaking peoples were present in Mesopotamia and the Levant from at least the 4th millennium BC, living alongside and gradually intermingling with the Sumerians, whose language belongs to no known family at all, a fact that itself remains unresolved. For centuries, the two groups shared cities, gods, and administrative systems so thoroughly interwoven that separating Sumerian from Semitic in the archaeological record is, more often than not, an exercise in frustration. So, when did a distinctly Semitic political identity, kingdoms, dynasties, self-declared rulers, actually emerge? The textbook answer points to figures like the kings of Kish, a city whose early dynastic rulers carried names many linguists classify as Semitic, centuries before Sargon ever took a throne. Kish held a kind of symbolic primacy in Mesopotamian tradition. Later, conquerors, including Sargon himself, sought the title King of Kish the way medieval rulers sought Rome's blessing. If Semitic kingship has a birthplace, many scholars would point here to Kish, sometime in the early 3rd millennium BC, and yet the deeper you look, the less solid that ground becomes. Consider Ebla, the northern Syrian city whose royal archive, over 15,000 tablets, stunned the scholarly world when it was uncovered in the 1970s. Ebla flourished around 2500 BC, ruled by kings with names clearly Semitic, governing a sophisticated bureaucracy centuries before Akkad's rise. For a brief moment, some scholars propose that Ebla might represent the true cradle of Semitic civilization, older, perhaps, than anything in Mesopotamia proper. That claim proved controversial, and most Assyriologists now favor a more cautious reading. Ebla as one node among several, not necessarily the origin point. But the debate exposed something uncomfortable: how little consensus actually exists about where Semitic identity first crystallized into kingship, and how much of the story rests on which archive happened to survive and which simply burned. Because that's the other thread running through this mystery. So much of what we know comes from destruction. Ebla's tablets survive precisely because the palace that housed them burned. The fire that should have destroyed the clay instead baked it hard, preserving it for 4,500 years. Without that fire, we might know almost nothing of Ebla at all. How many other cities, other archives, other Semitic-speaking dynasties existed and left no trace, simply because no fire happened to seal their memory in clay? The historical record we have may not be a map of what existed, only a map of what happened to survive, and that distinction troubles historians more than they often admit publicly. There's a further complication, one that rarely makes it past specialist journals into popular retellings: the Amorites. Emerging into the historical record around 2000 BC, the Amorites were another Semitic-speaking group, but their origins are murkier still. Mesopotamian texts describe them, often with disdain, as tent-dwelling outsiders from the western steppe, people who know no house, no grain. Yet within a few generations, Amorite dynasties would rule some of the greatest cities in Mesopotamia, including Babylon itself under Hammurabi. How does a people characterized in one century as rootless nomads become, in the next, the architects of one of history's most enduring legal and political traditions? Mainstream historians describe gradual settlement and assimilation, but the speed of that transformation, and the scarcity of archaeological evidence documenting the transition itself, has left room for more speculative readings. Theories, largely outside academic consensus, suggesting the Amorites' sudden rise reflects not assimilation, but the resurfacing of an older, previously undocumented Semitic political tradition that had simply existed beyond the reach of Mesopotamian scribes until circumstance forced it into the record. There is no definitive way, at present, to confirm or dismiss that idea. The tablets simply don't say. What remains certain is only this: by the time cuneiform texts begin naming kings, cities, and dynasties in a language we can classify as Semitic, that language and its speakers were already old, already woven so deeply into Mesopotamian civilization that no clean point of origin has ever been isolated. Every candidate, Kish, Ebla, the Amorite migrations, offers a plausible chapter, but none offers a beginning. Perhaps that absence of a clean origin is itself the most honest answer archaeology can give. Identity, in the ancient world as much as our own, rarely announces itself with a single seal, a single tablet, a single founding king. It accumulates unrecorded until the moment something, a fire, a conquest, a scribe with clay and a stylus, happens to catch it and hold it still. The question that remains, then, is not simply where the earliest Semitic kingdoms began. It's how much of that beginning we've already lost, and what, if anything, still lies beneath the ground, waiting for its own fire to preserve it. By now, a pattern may have started to reveal itself across these chapters: governors who vanish without explanation, kings whose very identity blurs at the edges, a succession crisis the ancient scribes themselves couldn't confidently narrate. And perhaps, at this point, a reasonable viewer might begin to wonder, how confident, really, are historians about when any of this happened at all? It's a fair question, and the honest answer is more unsettling than you might expect. Consider a single radiocarbon date pulled from a charred grain sample excavated at a Mesopotamian site, sitting in a laboratory tray somewhere, waiting to be cross-referenced against a king list, a planetary observation, and centuries of scholarly argument. That one small, carbonized seed sits at the center of one of Mesopotamian archaeology's quietest but most consequential mysteries. We don't actually agree on the absolute chronology of the late 3rd millennium BC. Every date given so far in this investigation, Sargon's rise around 2334 BC, Naram-Sin's revolt, Shar-kali-sharri's death around 2193 BC, rests on a chronological framework that is, in truth, a best estimate among several competing systems, not a settled fact. The problem begins with how Mesopotamian chronology is reconstructed in the first place. Ancient scribes didn't date events the way modern historians do, with a continuous numbered calendar. Instead, Mesopotamian records tracked time through king lists, year names commemorating notable royal events, and administrative archives listing rulers in sequence. The same king list, in fact, that gave us the uncertain succession following Shar-kali-sharri, and the same document whose reliability was already in question regarding the Gutian dynasty. To convert these relative sequences into fixed calendar years, historians rely on a small number of astronomical anchor points. Most famously, a recorded observation of the planet Venus during the reign of Ammisaduqa, a much later Babylonian king, whose reign can be independently dated through the regular, predictable cycles of Venus's visibility. That single astronomical anchor, however, admits multiple valid astronomical solutions, not just one, several distinct years, that each satisfy the recorded observation equally well. This has produced not one accepted chronology for the ancient Near East, but several competing ones, known among specialists as the long, middle, short, and ultra-short chronologies, each shifting the entire timeline of Mesopotamian history earlier or later by anywhere from several decades to well over a century, depending on which solution is adopted. The middle chronology, which places Hammurabi's reign around 1792 to 1750 BC, remains the most widely used framework in mainstream scholarship and the one generally reflected in textbooks and museum placards. But it is a convention, not a certainty, an agreed-upon working framework rather than a proven fact, and scholars continue to debate its accuracy even now. Why does this matter for the mysteries already explored in this investigation? Because every date assigned to Sargon, Naram-Sin, the Gutian kings, and the chaos following Shar-kali-sharri shifts along with whichever chronology one adopts, sometimes by decades, occasionally by more. The actual sequence of events, the relative order in which things happened, remains reasonably stable across all these competing systems. But the precise number of years separating Akkad's founding from its collapse, or the exact span during which those 21 Gutian kings supposedly reigned, remains genuinely, measurably uncertain, not due to any single missing archive, but because the entire mathematical scaffolding underlying ancient Near Eastern chronology admits more than one honest answer. Radiocarbon dating has, in recent decades, offered a partial corrective, an independent method, unmoored from Venus tablets and royal year names, capable of testing which chronological framework aligns more closely with physical evidence preserved in organic material, charred grain, wooden beams, even the bones of long-dead livestock. A significant study published in 2010, analyzing samples from sites across the region, lent support to a chronology running somewhat higher than the traditional middle chronology, suggesting some events may need to be pushed earlier than textbooks currently reflect. But radiocarbon dating carries its own margins of error, its own calibration challenges, and its own ongoing scholarly disputes. It has narrowed the range of disagreement, not eliminated it entirely. There's something quietly disorienting in this admission, one worth sitting with for a moment. The empire whose governors vanished without explanation, whose founding kings blur at the edges of myth, whose final rulers cycled through power too quickly for their own scribes to track. We cannot even say with complete confidence exactly when any of it took place, only roughly when and in what order. The uncertainty isn't a failure of modern scholarship so much as an honest reflection of how thin the thread connecting us to this era actually is. A scattering of clay tablets, a handful of astronomical observations open to multiple readings, and organic samples whose radiocarbon signatures still require careful, contested interpretation. Perhaps this uncertainty is, in its own way, the most fitting frame for everything explored so far. A civilization whose people, kings, and downfall keep slipping just slightly out of focus, refusing to resolve into the kind of clean, confident timeline modern minds instinctively crave. The Akkadians left behind an extraordinary record, more thorough than almost any other Bronze Age civilization. And still, 4,000 years later, we're left asking, not just what happened to them, but when, and how much of what we think we know might yet need to shift once the next tablet, the next grain sample, the next Venus calculation finally comes to light. East of Akkad, past the Zagros Mountains that once sheltered those 21 shadowy Gutian kings, past the very frontier where Mesopotamian scribes lost track of the enemies they feared most, the land rises into the highlands of southwestern Iran. Here, in the region the Akkadians called Elam, lies the ancient city of Susa, one of the oldest continuously inhabited urban settlements on Earth. Its layered ruins holding a civilization every bit as old as Sumer, and, in its own way, just as resistant to being fully understood. Picture a Proto-Elamite tablet, unearthed from beneath the mounds of Susa, its script pressed into clay sometime around 3100 BC. It is, in the truest sense, a written language. Its signs are systematic, repeated, clearly intentional. And yet, more than a century after its discovery, no one has been able to read it. Proto-Elamite remains one of the only major writing systems from the ancient Near East that scholars have never successfully deciphered. A script that recorded a civilization's earliest bureaucratic transactions in a language we cannot access, describing rulers whose names we may never recover in their own voice. By the time cuneiform literate scribes in Mesopotamia and later Elam itself began recording history in a script we can read, the kingdom of Elam had already developed one of the ancient world's most unusual approaches to royal succession, one that continues to puzzle historians studying the late 3rd millennium BC, the same uncertain era explored in the previous chapter. Rather than the father-to-son inheritance familiar from Akkadian and later Mesopotamian dynasties, early Elamite kingship appears to have followed something closer to a fraternal or avuncular pattern. The throne passing not from father to son, but from elder brother to younger brother, and only afterward to the eldest son of the original elder brother, in a system historians have labeled, with admitted uncertainty, as something resembling the later, better documented Elamite institution of the Sukalma, or Grand Regent. Is this reconstruction accurate? Mainstream Elamite scholarship treats it as the best available reading of a genuinely fragmentary record, pieced together largely from later Elamite inscriptions that retroactively describe earlier rulers, rather than from abundant contemporary documentation. And this is where the mystery deepens. Unlike Akkad, whose administrative habits left behind tens of thousands of tablets, early Elam's own Proto-Elamite archive remains illegible, meaning almost everything historians know about early Elamite kingship comes filtered through Mesopotamian eyes. Akkadian and Sumerian scribes describing a neighboring, rival civilization they fought, traded with, and periodically conquered, but did not, evidently, fully understand themselves. Consider the reign of Puzur-Inshushinak, one of the few early Elamite rulers whose name and deeds survive with reasonable clarity, largely because he left behind inscriptions in both Akkadian and, remarkably, in the undeciphered linear Elamite script. A rare instance of a ruler bridging two writing systems, one we can read and one we still cannot. His inscriptions boast of controlling a vast territory stretching from Susa deep into the Iranian plateau, achieved based on the timing, right around the same chaotic succession crisis following Shar-kali-sharri's death explored in the last chapter, suggesting Puzur-Inshushinak may have expanded his kingdom precisely while Akkad was consumed by the question of who was king and who was not king. And then, just as abruptly as those Akkadian governors and short-lived claimants before him, Puzur-Inshushinak disappears from the record. Later, Mesopotamian sources claim his kingdom was conquered by Ur-Nammu, founder of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. But Elamite sources, such as they are, offer no corroborating account of his fall, his death, or what became of his line of succession afterward. This absence matters because of what it might explain, or fail to explain. If Elamite succession truly operated on a fraternal model rather than direct paternal inheritance, the sudden disappearance of a powerful king like Puzur-Inshushinak wouldn't necessarily indicate conquest or catastrophe at all. It might simply reflect an internal transition of power to a brother or nephew, conducted through customs Mesopotamian scribes, accustomed to father-son succession, either didn't recognize or didn't bother to record accurately. Under this reading, some of what Mesopotamian sources describe as conquest might, from the Elamite side, have looked more like ordinary, expected succession, a difference in perspective rather than a difference in fact. More speculative theories venture further, questioning whether the very concept of a unified early Elamite kingdom reflects Mesopotamian simplification more than Elamite reality, proposing instead that Susa and the broader Elamite highlands may have functioned as a loose confederation of city-states and regional powers, only occasionally unified under a single dominant ruler like Puzur-in-Shushinak, with succession, in the Mesopotamian sense, being something closer to shifting alliances among competing highland centers, retroactively smoothed into a dynastic narrative by later Elamite tradition, much like the questions raised earlier about the Gutian king list. What remains undeniable is the wall of untranslated script standing between us and any definitive answer. Somewhere in the thousands of Proto-Elamite tablets still held in museum collections and excavation storerooms, the actual voice of this succession crisis may already be sitting, fully recorded, waiting only for a decipherment that has eluded scholars for over 100 years. Until that script finally yields its meaning, the question of how power truly passed between Elam's earliest rulers remains suspended between two civilizations' competing versions of the truth, one that we can read and one that for now still refuses to speak.